As the rain falls and the wind whispers through the trees, welcome back. Tonight you'll hear terrifying park ranger stories about Bigfoot, the Wendigo, and the dark secrets hidden deep within the forest. A heartfelt thank you to every subscriber and listener. Your support means everything. Now turn off the lights, relax, and let the sound of the rain guide you into the wilderness. Let's begin. My name is Caleb James Miller. I am 34 years old. I work as a backcountry wilderness park ranger. I live in Washington State, and the events I am about to write down took place in the autumn of 2016. I've kept these memory notes locked in a metal filing drawer in my home for nearly 8 years, handwritten on yellow legal pads that have grown stiff with age. For a long time, I believed that if I kept the story private, the mountain where it happened would eventually fade from my thoughts. I thought that if I did not speak the details out loud, the forest would stay on its side of the state and I would stay on mine. But the silence has not helped. When you spend 6 years carrying a secret that contradicts everything you were trained to believe about the physical world, it begins to act like weight on a suspension bridge. Eventually, something has to yield. I'm writing this down not to convince anyone, nor to seek validation from the agency I used to serve, but because I need to leave a clean record before the memory softens into something I can no longer trust. In September of 2016, I was stationed in the Wind River Ranger District of the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest, a stretch of land that encompasses over 1 million acres of timber, basalt canyons, volcanic caves, and glacial runoff streams in southwestern Washington. My official title was Wilderness Ranger, GS-07, assigned primarily to the Trapper Creek Wilderness and the higher elevations surrounding Observation Peak and the Big Lava Bed. It is hard, quiet work. Most people think park rangers spend their days wearing clean-brimmed hats and answering tourist questions at visitor center counters. But backcountry law enforcement and trail maintenance is a different discipline altogether. You spend weeks at a time out of cell service, clearing blowdowns with crosscut saws because motorized equipment is prohibited in federal wilderness areas, measuring boundary monuments set during the Great Depression, checking remote trail registers, and tracking missing hikers before the autumn freeze sets in. That year, autumn arrived early and hard. By late September, the hemlock and Douglas fir stands were soaked through with continuous, fine-grained Pacific Northwest drizzle, the kind of rain that doesn't fall so much as hang suspended in the air until your canvas coat is heavy enough to crush your shoulders. The mornings were cold, dark gray, and dead quiet. I shared the district work center near Carson with 2 other rangers. Mateo Vance was 52 at the time, a soft-spoken veteran who had spent 25 years with the Forest Service after growing up in northern New Mexico. Mateo was a precise, methodical man who mended his own leather boots with cobbler's wax and could identify every tree species in the Cascades by the smell of its shaved bark. The second was Sarah Lindqvist, a 26-year-old seasonal forestry technician from Duluth, Minnesota, who had taken the autumn appointment to build up her field hours before applying for a permanent post in Alaska. We were a good crew. We kept our boots greased, our radios charged, and our conversations short and practical. The first anomaly occurred on October 4th, during a routine 3-day sweep of Trail 192A, a decommissioned trail cut by the Civilian Conservation Corps in 1932 that weaves up the western ridge of Observation Peak toward an old abandoned fire lookout platform. The trail had been officially removed from the district maps in the late 1980s due to soil erosion and dangerous shale slides, but we still patrolled the lower junction twice a year to replace warning signage and deter off-trail bushwhackers. Mateo and I had packed in from the trailhead at Panther Creek just after dawn. The fog was low, sitting like wet fleece in the crowns of the noble firs, cutting off visibility at 50 yards. The soil was slick with rotting sword ferns and wet moss, and the only sound for miles was the rhythm of our own boots squelching in the mud and the slow, rhythmic drop of condensation from the canopy overhead. Around noon, we reached a section of old-growth timber where the trail crossed a dry creek bed known as Deadman Canyon. The trees here were enormous. Western red cedars 500 years old, their trunks 8 feet thick at the base, fluted like stone pillars. As we crossed the rock bed, Mateo stopped suddenly, lifting his hand to pause me. I stopped 3 paces behind him. "What is it?" I asked. Mateo didn't answer right away. He was staring at the trunk of a massive cedar about 20 yards off the cleared right-of-way. He unhooked his Pulaski axe from his pack loop, holding it casually by his side as he stepped into the heavy huckleberry brush. I followed him, my hand instinctively resting on the hip strap of my pack near my radio holster. When I reached his side, I saw what he was looking at. A blaze had been cut into the thick, fibrous bark of the cedar, a standard rectangular trail marker used by early forest surveyors to mark boundary corners. But this blaze was wrong. First, standard forest blazes are shaved 4 to 6 feet off the ground, right at eye level, using a hand adze or hatchet. This blaze was cut at least 12 feet up the trunk, far beyond the reach of any man standing on the forest floor, and even higher than someone could manage while standing on a horse. Second, the cut was completely fresh. The exposed inner heartwood was bright, pale yellow, slick with fresh resin that had not yet clouded over or drawn dust. The wood shavings beneath the tree were long, thin ribbon strips curled like paper, resting on top of the wet leaf litter. They had not been rained on. They had been carved within the last hour. Mateo reached up, pointing the handle of his Pulaski toward the fresh mark. "Look at the edge," he said. His voice was low, devoid of excitement, carrying only that flat, cautious tone experienced woodsmen use when something doesn't make sense. I leaned in closer. A tool cut in wood leaves distinct mark patterns. The bite of an axe head leaves a wedged notch, a draw knife leaves flat parallel striations, a saw leaves teeth tracks. This wood had no tool marks. The bark had been peeled back in a clean vertical strip, almost as if a giant thumb had pressed into the cedar and peeled it down like a banana skin, exposing the moist cambium layer beneath. "Bear?" I offered, though I knew as soon as the word left my mouth how foolish it sounded. Black bears mark trees in the autumn, but they use claws and teeth. They shred the bark, leaving vertical gashes and tufts of fur stuck in the sap. This was a smooth, rectangular strip, 8 inches wide and 2 feet long, perfectly plumb with the earth. "No bear did that," Mateo said quietly. He glanced around the forest floor. The brush around the base of the cedar was undisturbed. The thick carpet of feather moss was unpressed. There were no boot prints, no broken branches, no drag marks, no horse droppings. Mateo pulled his notebook from his breast pocket, sketched the mark, noted the coordinates from his Garmin unit, and taped a small piece of orange flagging ribbon to a nearby hemlock branch to mark the location. We didn't talk much about it for the rest of the day. In the Forest Service, you encounter strange things constantly. Illegal bow hunters doing bizarre things to territory markers, eccentric squatters living off-grid, or simply natural phenomena that present themselves in weird ways. You make a note, you report it to the district ranger if it poses a safety hazard, and you keep moving. 2 days later, on October 6th, the weather turned worse. A cold front drifted down from the Gulf of Alaska, dropping the ambient temperature to 34 degrees and turning the rain into a heavy, slushy sleet that coated the high ridges in a sheet of clear ice. That morning, a call came through the dispatch desk at the Carson station from the Skamania County Sheriff's Office. A solo hiker, a 58-year-old man from Portland named Arthur Pendleton, had failed to check in with his wife the previous evening. Pendleton was an experienced bushwalker who frequented the Trapper Creek area to photograph late-season fungi. He had parked his Subaru Outback at the Observation Peak trailhead on Tuesday morning. His vehicle was still there, covered in fallen fir needles and thin ice. Because Mateo and I had just covered Trail 192A, we were assigned to lead the initial hasty search alongside Deputy Frank Harlan, a local law enforcement officer who knew the roads around Wind River better than anyone. Sarah Lindqvist stayed at the district office to coordinate radio traffic and manage the topographic overlay maps. By 9 in the morning, the three of us were standing at the Observation Peak trailhead, zip-tying neon orange search tape to our packs and checking our gear. The wind through the tops of the Douglas firs sounded like a heavy train passing over an iron trestle 5 miles away. A low, continuous roar that filled the canyon and made hearing anything at ground level difficult. He was carrying a 3-day pack, Deputy Harlan told us, squinting against the sleet as he adjusted his heavy leather gun belt over his rain parka. His wife says he had a bright red canvas tent, a butane stove, and an older VHF handheld radio. He usually stays on the main trail, but he likes to drop into the drainage bottoms to look for shelf fungi on old blowdowns. "The drainages are grease right now," Mateo said, looking up toward the ridge shrouded in gray cloud. "If he went down into Panther Creek or Dead Man Canyon and took a fall, he's not getting back up on his own with a broken ankle." We split the search sector into 3 strips. Mateo took the upper ridge trail toward the old fire lookout. Deputy Harlan took the abandoned logging road that skirted the eastern boundary. I was assigned to search the floor of Deadman Canyon, the same drainage where Mateo and I had found the peeled cedar 2 days prior. We set our radios to channel 4, agreed on a 60-minute check-in schedule, and separated. Walking into Deadman Canyon alone in bad weather is a peculiar experience. The canyon is deep, narrow, and walled in by high terraces of exposed dark basalt that block out most ambient light. Even at midday, the forest floor feels like twilight. The trees grow so densely that the canopy catches most of the slush before it hits the ground, creating a strange, cold, dripping gloom beneath the branches. I walked slowly, using my wooden pacing staff to probe the deep pockets of sword fern and rotting logs. Every 50 yards I would stop, cup my hands around my mouth, and call out, "Arthur!" Search and rescue. Arthur Pendleton. The canyon was an acoustic nightmare. The high rock walls reflected sound in unpredictable ways. My own voice would travel 50 feet, hit a basalt face, and bounce back to me with a muffled, hollow delay that sounded almost like someone else answering from higher up the slope. Around 2 in the afternoon, I reached a section of the creek bed about a mile above the trail junction. The wind had dropped slightly, but the rain had turned into a steady, dense fog that hugged the canyon floor, reducing my field of vision to 20 feet. The temperature had dropped enough that my breath came out in thick, white plumes that hung in the still air before dissolving. I stopped near a large gravel bar where the creek made an S-curve through a grove of ancient mountain hemlocks. I turned off my flashlight to conserve the battery and listened. At first, there was only the natural sound of the wilderness. The wet drop of water falling from needle tips, the rush of the creek over mossy stones, and the distant, dull groan of 2 rubbing tree trunks swaying in the high wind. Then, the ambient sound stopped. It did not fade out gradually like wind dying down. It vanished instantly, as if someone had pulled a master plug on an audio board. The rush of the creek water suddenly sounded muffled, as if I were listening to it through a thick wool blanket pressed against my ears. The dripping of the rain became imperceptible. The air grew remarkably dense, heavy with the sharp, cold scent of wet iron and crushed, dry hemlock needles, a smell that made no sense given that every leaf and twig in the forest was currently soaked with ice water. I stood completely still on the gravel bar. My skin prickled under my layers of wool and Gore-Tex. Every ranger knows the instinct that hits when the forest goes quiet. It usually means a large predator, like a mountain lion, has moved into the immediate area, and the birds and small mammals have gone to ground. But this was different. This wasn't just birds stopping their songs. The mechanical acoustics of the valley itself had been flattened. I reached for my radio on my chest strap, pressed the push-to-talk button, and spoke softly. "Base, this is Ranger Miller. Checking in from Sector 2, Deadman Creek floor, over." Static answered me. Not the usual sharp, crackling white noise of an open channel, but a wet, heavy hiss, like the sound of water being poured onto hot coals. "Mateo, Harlan, this is Caleb. Do you copy?" The radio hissed again. Then, through the wet static, a sound came through the speaker. It was small, tinny, and distorted by distance, but clear enough to make out. It was the sound of footsteps walking on dry gravel. Crunch, crunch, crunch. The footsteps were measured, heavy, and completely rhythmic. But I was standing on the only gravel bar in that section of the canyon, and my feet were firmly planted in the mud. "Arthur?" I called out, letting go of the radio and stepping toward the thicket of hemlocks at the edge of the bar. "Arthur Pendleton? Is that you?" No voice answered. The gravel crunching stopped on the radio speaker, replaced by 3 brief, rhythmic puffs of air, like someone exhaling heavily directly into a microphone. And then the radio went completely dead, the screen flashing an error code before shutting off entirely. I unholstered my agency-issued Glock 22, holding it low at my side. I knew it was likely a hardware failure caused by the cold and wet weather, but the instinct to arm myself was visceral and immediate. I moved off the gravel bar and into the hemlocks. 10 feet inside the tree line, the acoustic deadness vanished as suddenly as it had arrived. The rush of the creek roared back into my ears with startling volume. The sound of rain hitting my hood returned, and the air smelled once again of damp mud and decayed vegetation. I found Arthur Pendleton's gear 20 yards later. It was not scattered or torn. It had not been dragged by an animal or tossed in a panic. It was arranged with meticulous, chilling precision on a flat basalt ledge under the shelter of a wide hemlock overhang. His red canvas pack was set upright against the rock wall. His external frame was unbuckled. Placed neatly side by side on top of the pack were his waterproof outer jacket, his wool cap, his leather gloves, and his hiking boots. The boots were positioned side by side, facing straight out toward the dark thicket laced tightly all the way to the top eyelets, even though there were no feet inside them. Beside the boots lay his VHF radio, his compass, and his pocket knife. The blade of the knife was open, driven 2 inches deep into the soft, rotten wood of a fallen log nearby. The clothing was dry. It had been folded. There was no blood. There were no signs of a struggle. There were no tracks in the soft soil around the ledge except for my own boot prints. I stood there in the fog, looking at the neatly stacked belongings of a grown man who had simply vanished out of his clothes in 30-degree weather miles from the nearest road. "Pendleton!" I shouted as loud as I could, turning in a full circle with my sidearm raised. "Arthur!" The canyon returned only my own echo, delayed and distorted by the basalt cliffs, bouncing back to me through the wet trees. "Arthur, Arthur, Arthur." I radioed Mateo using my backup handheld unit. The signal went through this time, clear and crisp. Within 45 minutes, Mateo and Deputy Harlan reached my position, their faces flushed from hiking down the steep, slick shale banks. Deputy Harlan knelt by the ledge, touching the folded wool coat with a gloved finger. He didn't say anything for a long time. His face was pale under his rain hood. "Hypothermia?" Harlan asked finally, though he didn't sound convinced. "Paradoxical undressing. People get cold, their brain gets confused. They think they're burning up and they take off their clothes. Paradoxical undressing happens in the final stages of severe hypothermia," Mateo said flatly, kneeling beside him. "They don't fold their coats neatly. They don't unlace their boots and place them side by side. They tear their clothes off in a panic and crawl into bushes or under rocks to die." "And where is his body, Frank? Where are his socks?" Harlan had no answer. We spent the remaining daylight hours searching a 200-yard radius around the basalt ledge. We found nothing. No broken branches overhead to indicate a fall from the cliffs. No drag marks, no blood. No scent for the search dogs that were brought in the following morning. Arthur Pendleton had simply stopped existing on that ledge, leaving behind his boots and his dry folded jacket. By October 12th, the official search for Arthur Pendleton was scaled down. Skamania County Sheriff's Department suspended active ground sweeps, leaving the case open as a missing person file. The weather had turned brutal. 4 inches of slushy snow fell over the higher elevations, bearing any subtle ground sign that might have remained. The district office was quiet. The mood among the staff had shifted from professional concern to a cold, tense unease. We all knew the statistics. People go missing in federal parks every year, often under strange or tragic circumstances involving sudden weather changes, hidden drop-offs, or pre-existing medical conditions. But none of us could reconcile the state of that basalt ledge with anything we had seen in our careers. On October 16th, I was assigned to spend 2 nights at the Observation Peak Guard Station. The station is a small one-room stone cabin built by the CCC in 1938, situated on a high exposed knob at an elevation of nearly 4,500 feet. It features a hip roof, heavy wooden shutters over small multi-paned windows, a wood-burning cast-iron stove, and a wraparound wooden porch. Its primary purpose was to serve as an emergency shelter for trail crews and a radio relay point during early autumn weather shifts. My task was simple: winterize the cabin, seal the storm shutters, clear the drainage gutters around the perimeter, and maintain a radio watch for any poachers or unauthorized snowmobile users operating in the wilderness boundary. I hiked up from the Panther Creek trailhead alone on Thursday morning. My pack was heavy, loaded with 3 days of rations, extra propane canisters, my sleeping bag, a heavy tool roll, and my service weapon. The trail was hard going. The 4 inches of wet slush had frozen overnight into a crusty, treacherous ice glaze that cracked under my boots with every step. The forest was dead still. There was no wind, no bird call, no animal movement. The only sound was the sharp crunch snap of my crampons, breaking through the ice crust into the dark leaf litter beneath. I reached the guard station at 3 in the afternoon. The cabin looked lonely sitting on the bald basalt spur above the tree line. Below me the forest stretched out for 20 miles in every direction, an endless sea of dark green Douglas firs and hemlocks shrouded in gray ribbons of low-hanging clouds. To the north, the massive snow-covered cone of Mount St. Helens sat hidden behind a thick wall of slate-gray storm clouds. I unlocked the heavy padlocks on the cabin door, carried my gear inside, and set to work. I stacked split cedar in the wood box, lit the cast-iron stove, and started a pot of water for coffee. The small room quickly filled with the dry, sweet smell of burning cedar smoke and heated iron. By 5 o'clock, night fell completely. In the high backcountry, darkness does not come on gradually. Once the sun drops behind the western ridges, the sky shuts down like an iron trap. I sat at the small wooden table near the shuttered window, eating a meal of heat-and-serve chili and writing up my log entry for the day by the warm yellow glow of a propane lantern. The radio on the shelf beside me hummed with soft ambient static, set to the district channel. At 8:15 p.m., the radio crackled. "Observation station, this is Carson Work Center. Do you copy, Caleb?" It was Sarah's voice, clear and comforting through the speaker. I picked up the hand mic. "Copy you loud and clear, Sarah. Weather is calm up here. Temperatures dropping fast, currently 26 degrees. How are things down below?" "Quiet," she said. "District Ranger wants to make sure you check the roof braces on the south porch tomorrow morning, before the heavy snow hits on Saturday. We're expecting 6 to 8 inches above 4,000 feet. "Will do," I replied. "I'll clean the stovepipe while I'm at it." "Anything else?" There was a brief pause on the line, a silence slightly longer than standard radio etiquette required. "Caleb?" Sarah's voice came back lower this time. "Go ahead, Sarah." "Mateo left for his residence about an hour ago," she said, her tone cautious. "He was looking through some old logbooks from the 50s and 60s that we have stored in the archive vault in the basement. Files from the old ranger district before the boundaries were redrawn." "What about them?" "He didn't say much," Sarah said. "He just copied down a few entry dates from 1954 and 1961. Both were autumn disappearances near Observation Peak. Both times, they found the victim's gear folded neatly on rock shelves within 2 miles of Trail 192A. Neither body was ever recovered." A chill ran down my spine, sharp and distinct, despite the heat radiating from the cast-iron stove. "Did the log say anything else?" I asked. "No," Sarah said softly. "Just that the search crews back then kept reporting hearing their own names called back to them from the thickets, even when they knew no other searchers were in the grid. Just be careful up there tonight, all right? The weather's turning weird." "I'm fine, Sarah. The cabin is solid, and I've got plenty of wood. I'll check in at 0700. "Copy that. Good night, Caleb." "Good night." I hung up the hand mic and sat in silence for a long time. The propane lantern hummed softly on the wooden table, casting long, jumping shadows against the rough-hewn log walls. Outside, the temperature had plummeted, and a light wind had begun to pick up, whining softly through the gaps in the wooden shutters. I stood up, walked to the door, slid back the iron deadbolt, and stepped out onto the wraparound porch to fetch another armload of firewood from the outdoor bin. The cold hit my face like a wet towel. The sky above was pitch black, completely overcast with no moon or stars visible. The air was bone dry now, freezing, smelling faintly of ozone and old dust. I walked to the wood bin on the eastern side of the porch, loaded 4 heavy cedar logs into the crook of my left arm, and turned to head back inside. That was when I heard it. It came from the dark tree line at the edge of the cabin clearing, about 40 yards down the steep slope. It was the sound of a heavy boot stepping onto the frozen crust of snow. Crunch. I froze. My thumb slid down to unbutton the safety strap on my sidearm holster. "Who's there?" I called out into the darkness. My voice sounded thin and small against the vast empty slope of the mountain. No answer. Only the low whistle of the wind through the eaves of the cabin. I reached into my coat pocket with my free right hand, pulled out my high lumens LED tactical flashlight, and clicked it on. A sharp, narrow beam of bright white light cut through the pitch darkness, illuminating the clear-cut area, the snow-dusted basalt boulders, and the wall of black fir trees at the edge of the clearing. I swept the beam across the snow. There were no tracks in the snow outside the perimeter of the cabin porch. The white surface was completely smooth, undisturbed, glistening like ground glass under the beam. I exhaled a long breath, letting my shoulders drop slightly. Getting jumpy, I muttered to myself. I took 2 steps back toward the open cabin door. Crunch, crunch. The sound came again instantly, perfectly matching the 2 steps I had just taken. But it didn't come from 40 yards down the slope this time. It came from the wraparound porch around the corner on the northern side of the cabin. I turned instantly, bringing the flashlight beam around the corner of the porch wall. The porch was empty. The rough sawn pine planks were bare, lightly dusted with a thin skim of wind-blown frost. I stood completely frozen in place, my heart hammering against my ribs with the force of a trapped bird. I listened with every fiber of my body. For 10 long seconds, there was only the hum of my own breathing. Then came the sound. It was breathing. Not animal panting, nor the deep, heavy rasp of a bear or elk. It was human breathing, slow, shallow, and completely steady. But it was not coming from the porch. It was coming from inside my own throat. Except I was holding my breath. I could feel the air in my lungs sitting completely still. My chest motionless, yet the sound of a steady, rhythmic exhale was vibrating softly in the air right beside my left ear, so close I could feel a faint, icy draft against the skin of my neck. I didn't think. I didn't analyze. I bolted back into the cabin, slammed the heavy oak door shut, threw the iron deadbolt into place, and dropped the heavy wooden security bar across the frame. I backed away from the door, my flashlight beam shaking wildly as I aimed it at the heavy timber entrance. My sidearm was drawn now, held with both hands in front of me, pointed at the center of the wood paneling. Outside on the wooden porch planks, the sound began. It was the sound of someone walking. Step, step, step. It moved slowly around the perimeter of the cabin. Unhurried, heavy, each footfall coming with a distinct, wet wood creak that I knew intimately from walking those exact planks earlier that afternoon. It moved from the eastern side, around the northern corner, past the shuttered window, and stopped directly outside the front door. I held my breath. My finger rested lightly against the trigger of my Glock. My eye locked onto the brass door handle. The handle did not move. There was no rattling of the latch, no pounding on the wood, no demanding voice asking for shelter. Instead, there was a sound that made my skin crawl so violently I almost dropped my weapon. It was a voice. It came from right outside the heavy oak planks, less than 3 inches from my face. "Observation station, this is Carson Work Center. Do you copy, Caleb?" It was Sarah's voice. It had the exact cadence, the exact pitch, the exact warmth it had possessed through the radio speaker 20 minutes earlier. But it was flat. It sounded like an audio recording played through a cheap speaker in an empty room, lacking any natural human breath or inflection behind the words. I didn't answer. I couldn't speak. My mouth was bone dry, my tongue thick and heavy. The voice waited 3 seconds. Then it spoke again. "Observation station, this is Carson Work Center. Do you copy, Caleb?" It repeated the sentence 3 times, using the exact same audio profile, down to the slight microsecond pause before my name. Then it stopped. Silence fell over the ridge again, heavy, cold, and absolute. Outside, I heard the heavy footfalls resume. Step, step, step. They moved away from the door, down the porch stairs and out onto the frozen ground. But as they moved across the snow toward the dark timber line, the sound changed. It was no longer one pair of feet walking, it sounded like 2 sets of feet. Walking in precise, perfect synchronization, one step half a second behind the other, a main step followed immediately by a lighter, dragging second step that sounded like leather boots being drawn through dry leaves. I spent the rest of the night sitting on the floor in the center of the cabin, my back pressed against the warm iron of the wood stove, my handgun resting across my knees and my flashlight pointed at the front door. I did not sleep. I did not move. I listened to the wind whistle through the shutters until the dark gray light of dawn finally crept under the doorframe at 7 in the morning. When daylight came, I threw my pack together in 10 minutes, unbarred the door, and stepped out onto the porch with my gun drawn. The morning was blindingly bright. A high, clear winter sun had broken through the cloud deck, casting long blue shadows across the sparkling snow. I walked around the perimeter of the cabin porch to where the footsteps had stopped outside the shuttered window. There were tracks in the snow. They did not look like human boot prints, nor did they look like animal tracks. They were smooth, oval depressions in the frozen crust, roughly 16 inches long and 4 inches wide, perfectly flat at the bottom as if the snow had been compressed by a heavy, smooth metal beam. They were spaced 6 feet apart, leading straight from the forest line, up onto the wooden porch stairs around the building, and back down into the timber. Where the tracks crossed the wooden steps, the frost had not been stepped on or scraped away. The wood beneath the oval depressions was stripped clean, the gray varnish pulled completely off the timber, exposing the raw, bright, pale yellow grain beneath, slick with fresh sap. It was the same clean, peeled wood Mark Mateo and I had found on the western red cedar in Dead Man Canyon. I didn't wait to complete my winterization list. I didn't fix the roof braces or clean the stovepipe. I locked the cabin door, threw my pack on my back, and descended the mountain as fast as my legs could carry me, not stopping until I saw the yellow hood of my Forest Service truck parked at the Panther Creek trailhead. When I got back to the Carson Work Center, I said nothing about the voice, the tracks, or the peeled wood on the porch. In this line of work, once you start filing reports about phantom voices and impossible tracks, you aren't assigned to backcountry patrols anymore. You're assigned to a desk in Vancouver, or sent for a mandatory psychological evaluation. I told Mateo and Sarah simply that the cabin was secured, and that the weather had been rough. Mateo looked at me closely when I came in. He noticed the dark circles under my eyes and the way my hands shook when I poured a mug of black coffee. But he didn't press me. He was a veteran. He knew when a man needed space. On October 24th, the event occurred that finally ended my career with the United States Forest Service. It was a Monday. A heavy fog had rolled down from the Columbia River Gorge, settling over the entire district in a thick, wet soup that reduced visibility on the forest roads to less than 20 feet. Mateo had gone out at 8 in the morning to conduct a routine survey of a boundary fence on the far western edge of the district near Big Lava Bed, a massive ancient basalt flow covering 30 square miles of rugged, jagged rock covered in thick brush and treacherous, hidden lava tubes. By 4 in the afternoon, Mateo had not returned. He had not checked in over the radio at his scheduled 1400 marker. Sarah tried calling his unit repeatedly from the dispatch console. Ranger Vance, this is Carson Dispatch. Do you copy? Mateo, please check in. Nothing came back except the flat, wet hiss of open static. By 5 o'clock, with the sun setting and the temperature dropping rapidly toward freezing, District Ranger Stevens called a local tactical search. Deputy Harlan was notified and Sarah stayed behind to manage the base communications. I took my rig and drove out toward the Big Lava Bed trail junction alone, my fog lamps cutting 2 bright yellow tunnels through the dense gray mist. Reached Mateo's white Ford F-150, parked at the end of Forest Road. 5-7 at 5:30. His truck was idling. The headlights were turned on, shining into the thick fog. The driver's side door was wide open, the interior light casting a soft yellow glow on the empty bench seat. His handheld GPS unit was sitting on the dashboard, still turned on, its screen flashing a satellite connection error. His service weapon was still in its locking cradle between the seats. I pulled my truck up behind his, leaving my engine running and my emergency lights flashing red and blue against the mist. Mateo, I called out, stepping into the freezing drizzle with my heavy flashlight in hand. Mateo! The silence of the Big Lava Bed was absolute. Unlike the forest, which has soft soil and fallen leaves to absorb sound, the lava bed is a barren landscape of sharp, broken basalt rock, deep crevices, and stunted pine trees. Sound doesn't travel here. It gets trapped in the jagged rock crevices and dies. I grabbed my pack, my secondary radio, and my winter search kit from the back of my truck, and stepped past Mateo's open cab into the lava field. I followed the boundary fence line. The terrain was brutal, sharp, jagged blocks of black basalt covered in slick, wet reindeer lichen. A single misstep meant a broken ankle or a 15-foot drop into an unseen lava tube. Every 30 yards I stopped, shone my light into the crevices, and called his name. Mateo, it's Caleb. Answer me. At 6:15, 300 yards into the lava field, my radio crackled to life on my shoulder harness. It wasn't Sarah. It was Mateo's voice. Caleb. The signal was weak, broken by heavy interference, but it was distinctly Mateo. His voice sounded calm, slow, and strangely distant, like he was speaking from the back of a deep cavern. I grabbed the mic immediately. "Mateo, where are you?" "I'm at your truck. I'm on the boundary line." A pause. The static hissed wetly in my ear. "I found the cap." His voice came back slow and measured. "The survey cap from 32. It's turned, Caleb. It's turned in the rock." "Mateo, stay where you are," I shouted into the mic, moving as fast as I safely could across the slick basalt blocks. "Are you hurt? Do you have your flashlights?" "It doesn't make a sound when it walks," Mateo said. His voice didn't sound frightened. It sounded fascinated, carried by that cold, flat curiosity that had come over him when he looked at the peeled cedar 2 weeks earlier. "It doesn't break the frost. It's standing in the pine, Caleb. It's tall. It's so tall." "Mateo, stop talking and give me a fix. Are you north of the fence line?" "It has Arthur's coat," Mateo whispered through the speaker. "It folded it so nicely. Mateo." The radio transmission cut out completely. I broke into a run, scrambling over the sharp basalt blocks, tearing the knees of my canvas trousers on the jagged edges, ignoring the cold rain that was soaking through my gear. I reached a wide depression basin in the center of the lava bed, a place where an ancient lava tube had collapsed centuries ago, creating a bowl of dark, broken stone surrounded by a ring of stunted lodgepole pines. My flashlight beam cut across the floor of the basin. There, in the center of the depression, stood Mateo Vance. He was standing completely still on a flat table of black basalt, his back turned to me, facing the ring of pines on the far side of the basin. He had removed his heavy high-vis rain parka, his wool sweater, his leather work belt, and his boots. They were laid out on the flat rock beside his feet, stacked with terrifying geometric perfection. "Mateo!" I screamed, dropping my pack and sliding down the slick basalt slope into the basin. "Mateo, stop!" He didn't turn around. He didn't move. He stood in his thin undershirt and cotton socks in 28-degree weather, staring straight ahead into the tree line. I reached him, grabbing him roughly by his bare shoulder, pulling him back with all my weight. His skin was freezing, cold as iron pulled from a winter stream, but his face was completely relaxed, his eyes wide, clear, and unblinking, reflecting the beam of my flashlight. "Mateo, look at me," I yelled, shaking him. "Look at me." Slowly, very slowly, his head turned toward me. His eyes locked onto mine, but he didn't seem to see me. He looked through me as if I were made of glass. "It doesn't have a face, Caleb," he said softly, his breath coming out in thin, feeble wisps of mist. "It's just wood underneath. It's all peeled wood." I didn't look at the tree line. Every survival instinct I had developed over 6 years in the wilderness screamed at me not to look into the timber at the edge of that basin. I knew that if I swung my flashlight beam toward those lodgepole pines, if I looked at whatever was standing there waiting in the gray fog, I would never leave that lava bed. I grabbed Mateo under his arms, lifting his heavy frame by main force. "We're leaving. Right now." He didn't resist, but he didn't help me either. He was completely limp, a dead weight in my arms. I dragged him backwards out of the basin, up the slick basalt wall, leaving his boots, his folded parka, and his gear sitting on that flat rock shelf in the rain. I don't remember the hike back to the trucks clear as a sequence of events. It exists in my memory only as a series of disjointed, terrifying images: the blinding yellow fog, the sharp bite of rock against my bleeding knees, the sound of my own ragged, gasping breath, and behind us, always 20 paces behind us in the dark, the sound of the double step. Crunch, we drag step. Crunch, we drag step. It followed us all the way to the edge of the lava field. It didn't rush us. It didn't roar. It simply walked behind us at an unhurried, measured pace, keeping time with my frantic steps, waiting for me to trip, waiting for me to drop Mateo, waiting for me to turn around and look. I didn't turn around. I kept my eyes locked on the faint red flashing glow of my truck's emergency lights visible through the fog. I hauled Mateo into the passenger seat of my truck, slammed the door, shoved him across the seat, leapt into the driver's side, threw the transmission into reverse, and tore down Forest Road 6507 at 60 miles an hour, the rear wheels fishtailing wildly on the loose gravel. Mateo Vance survived that night, but he was never the same man. He spent 2 weeks in the hospital in Vancouver suffering from severe hypothermia, acute mental shock and neurological complications brought on by exposure. He never returned to the Forest Service. When he was released, he packed his belongings into a small trailer, moved back to northern New Mexico to live near his sister, and refused to speak to anyone from the agency ever again. The official report filed by the district ranger stated that Ranger Vance had suffered a severe episode of disorientation and hypothermia, brought on by sudden weather conditions while conducting boundary maintenance, and that Ranger Miller had performed a successful emergency extraction under hazardous conditions. Mateo's missing gear, his boots, his parka, his radio, was listed as lost in the field during search operations. No one went back into the big lava bed basin to retrieve it. I handed in my formal resignation 3 days later, on October 28, 2016. My supervisor tried to talk me out of it. He offered me an administrative transfer to an urban district in Puget Sound, or a desk assignment at the regional headquarters in Portland. He told me I was a promising officer with a clear path to advancement. I told him I was done. I didn't give him a long explanation. I packed my uniforms, my badges, and my field gear into 2 cardboard boxes, turned in my agency keys and my sidearm, and drove out of the Carson station for the last time while the autumn rain washed over the hood of my truck. I moved to eastern Washington, to the high dry country near Spokane where the trees are sparse, the land is flat, and you can see the horizon 5 miles away in every direction. I took a job working for a local farm equipment supplier. Dry, practical, uninteresting work that involves concrete floors, fluorescent lighting, and loud diesel engines. It has been nearly 8 years since that autumn in the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest. I have not returned to the Cascades. I do not camp. I do not hunt. I do not take weekend walks in state parks. And I turn down invitations from friends who want to go fishing along the rivers. People ask me sometimes why I left a career I had spent 4 years in college preparing for. I usually tell them I got tired of the cold weather or that the pay wasn't worth the isolation. It is easier to let them think I was lazy or soft than to explain what actually exists under the gray-green canopy of those mountain drainages. Most people believe that the wilderness is dangerous because of wild animals, sudden storms, or treacherous terrain. They think that if you carry a map, a compass, a radio, and a gun, you are safe. They believe the forest is just a collection of trees, soil, and water that obeys the laws of natural science. They are wrong. There are places on this continent, deep pockets of old timber, basalt basins, and forgotten survey drainages, where the land does not belong to us, where the forest geometry shifts when the fog rolls in, and where something ancient and silent sits in the high hemlocks, waiting. It doesn't want your life in a way a predator does. It doesn't hunt for food. It collects things. It collects your tracks, your voice, your name, your clothes, and finally, the quiet center of your mind, leaving behind only peeled wood and dry folded coats on cold stone ledges. I thought I had escaped it when I moved east across the state. I thought 50 miles of open wheat fields and dry basalt coulees would be enough of a buffer. But 2 nights ago, on a cold, foggy Tuesday in late October, I woke up at 3 in the morning to the sound of rain falling on my roof. I lay in bed in the dark, listening to the soft, rhythmic drop of water against the window pane. Then, down the hallway in my empty living room, I heard it. It was a small, tinny sound coming from the small decorative shelf where I keep my old wristwatch and keys. It was the sound of a heavy boot stepping onto a dry wooden plank. Crunch. I lay completely motionless under my blankets, my heart stopping in my chest. My eyes locked on the open bedroom door that leads into the dark hallway. From the darkness of the hall, a voice spoke, soft, flat, and completely devoid of human breath, carrying the exact cadence and pitch of my own voice from 8 years ago. "Base, this is Ranger Miller, checking in from Sector 2. Do you copy?" I did not answer. I pulled the blankets up to my chest, closed my eyes, and listened as the heavy double step moved slowly, unhurriedly down the hallway toward my door. The tense outer vestibule was fully unzipped and pinned back. Sitting directly in the middle of the open doorway was a pair of dirty synthetic hiking boots. They were set neatly side by side, pointing outward toward the clearing, as if someone had placed them there with meticulous care before stepping inside. I knelt beside the boots and touched the leather. They were completely dry, not damp, not splattered with mud, but bone dry, as if they had been sitting inside a warm house moments before. "David?" I called out, my voice sounding flat and muffled under the thick canopy. "David Krasner? National Park Ranger. Is anyone in there?" There was no response. The only sound was the cold rain clicking against the nylon rainfly. I used the end of my collapsible baton to carefully push aside the inner door mesh. Ray held his light over my shoulder, casting a harsh white circle into the dark interior. The tent was entirely empty, or rather it was empty of a human body, but everything else was intact. A winter sleeping bag was unrolled and laid out flat on top of an insulated foam sleeping pad. Beside the bag sat a lightweight camping stove, a half-empty water bladder, a folded topographical map, and an unlit headlamp. A silver stainless steel camp cup sat upright on the corner of the pad. It was half filled with clear water. "Where the hell is he?" Sarah whispered, her light darting around the small enclosure. He wouldn't walk away from his shelter without his boots. Not in this terrain. Not in this rain. I stepped back out of the tent and looked down at the ground surrounding the campsite. The moss was soft and thick, the kind that retains impressions for hours. There were no footmarks leading away from the tent. No crushed ferns, no disturbed mud, no slides down the steep slope toward the river. Ray was standing a few yards away, examining the massive trunk of the Sitka spruce overhead. The tree was enormous, easily 9 feet in diameter at its base, its bark rough and deeply furrowed. "Tom," Ray said softly. His voice lacked its usual steady, pragmatic tone. I walked over to him. "What did you find?" He held his flashlight upward, casting the beam about 12 feet up the trunk of the tree, into the lower fork where the first massive branch sprang outward from the main stem. Sitting neatly on top of that mossy branch, 12 feet off the ground, was a small pile of clothing. I unclipped my heavy-duty flashlight and focused the beam. It was a red waterproof shell jacketing a gray fleece liner, neatly folded into a square stack. Resting on top of the fleece was a pair of heavy wool socks and a dark green watch cap. "He stripped?" Sarah asked, her voice tight as she joined us. "Paradoxical undressing? From hypothermia?" "Paradoxical undressing happens in the final stages of severe hypothermia," I said, thinking through the mechanics of it. "When the body's vasodilation fails and the victim feels like they're burning up." But why would he climb 12 feet up a smooth spruce trunk in his bare feet in the freezing dark, fold his clothes into a neat pile, leave his boots on the ground perfectly dry, and then disappear? "He didn't," Ray said slowly. "He didn't offer an alternative explanation. He just kept his light fixed on that folded pile of clothes high up in the dripping dark." We spent the next 2 hours searching the immediate area in an expanding grid. We called Krasner's name until our throats were raw, the sound swallowed up almost instantly by the vast wet density of the timber. We checked the riverbank, illuminated the dark pools beneath fallen log jams, and dragged our tracking sticks through the underbrush. We found nothing. No blood, no signs of a struggle, no animal tracks, no broken branches to indicate a fall. It was as if David Krasner had walked into that small glade, taken off his footwear, set his gear down with deliberate orderliness, and then simply ceased to exist in the physical world. By 5 o'clock, night had settled over the peninsula like a heavy wet wool blanket. The rain turned into a blinding downpour, driven by gusts of wind that made the old-growth canopy groan and creak around us. Searching in the dark under those conditions was not only useless, it was dangerous. Dead branches, what we call widowmakers, frequently break free from the upper canopy during autumn gales and drop 200 feet to the forest floor without warning. We radioed the situation back to Port Angeles. Dispatch instructed us to mark the campsite coordinates on our GPS, leave the tent and gear in place for the forensics team if the weather cleared, and fall back to the old Queets patrol cabin 3 miles downriver to spend the night. The Queets patrol cabin is a small, rustic structure built by the Civilian Conservation Corps back in the 1930s. It sits on a high cedar bench above the river, constructed from heavy peeled Douglas fir logs with a cedar shake roof and a fieldstone fireplace. It has no electricity, no running water, and no cell service. It is a refuge designed purely to keep backcountry rangers out of the fatal damp of the rainforest. By the time we pulled open the heavy wooden door and stepped inside, we were all chilled to the bone. Sarah immediately set to work cleaning the river mud off her boots, while Ray unlatched the cast iron door of the wood stove and began laying a fire with dry cedar splinters left behind by the previous ranger. I sat down at the heavy pine table, pulled out the logbook and opened my waterproof field notebook. My hands were stiff from the cold and I had to force my fingers to grip the pen. "I don't like it," Sarah said suddenly. She was sitting on one of the wooden bunks, staring at the small window where the rain was beating against the glass in heavy erratic sheets. "I've worked search and rescue cases in Rainier and the Cascades. I've seen people do irrational things when hypothermia sets in. I've seen them crawl under boulders or strip their clothes off. But that campsite didn't look like panic. It looked organized." "That's what bothers me," Ray said, dropping a match into the stove. A small crackle of fire illuminated his weathered face. It looked like a display. We didn't speak much after that. We ate a silent meal of heat-and-eat rations off the wood stove, drank hot instant coffee from tin mugs, and listened to the storm battering the cabin. The wind was coming out of the southwest, howling up the river corridor and tearing through the treetops with a sound like a low, continuous freight train. Around 10 o'clock, Ray went to his bunk and fell into a deep, exhausted sleep. Sarah lay on her cot across the room, tossing periodically, her breathing shallow and restless. I couldn't sleep. The image of those dry boots sitting in the open door of that tent, and that neatly folded pile of fleece sitting high up in the mossy branch of the spruce, kept loop playing in my mind. Every rule of logic I had accumulated over 8 years in the wilderness felt slightly warped, like a wooden frame distorted by moisture. At midnight, I got up from the table, adjusted my oil lamp, and went to the small south-facing window to check the exterior thermometer attached to the outer casing. The temperature had dropped to 34 degrees. The rain was turning into a wet, slushy sleet that rattled violently against the glass. As I stood there looking out into the total, suffocating blackness of the surrounding forest, I heard a sound. It was faint at first, almost completely lost beneath the roar of the wind in the canopy and the rush of the river down below. It was a sharp, rhythmic sound. Tock, tock, tock. It was the sound of something hard, a piece of dense hardwood or a stone striking a hollow cedar trunk. It came from the dense timber just beyond the edge of the cabin clearing, perhaps 50 yards to the west. I froze, listening intently. In the backcountry, you hear all sorts of strange noises. Tree limbs rubbing together under wind stress can produce uncanny creaks, pops, and squeals. Falling deadwood can sound like footsteps. But this sound had a distinct, deliberate cadence. 3 strikes, a pause of precisely 4 seconds, and then 3 strikes again. Tock, tock, tock. I turned my head toward the bunks. Ray was still snoring softly, his arm draped over his forehead. Sarah was still. I grabbed my flashlight and my heavy wool jacket, pulled on my wet boots, and unlatched the heavy wooden bolt of the cabin door, stepping out onto the covered porch. The cold air hit me like a physical wall. The night was vast and absolutely dark. The light of my heavy flashlight cut a bright, narrow cone through the driving sleet, illuminating the gray trunks of the surrounding trees and the heavy fronds of fern glistening with ice. "Hello?" I called out, stepping to the edge of the porch steps. "Is someone out there?" The wind whipped my words away instantly, carrying them down toward the river. I stood waiting, the beam of my light tracking slowly across the edge of the tree line. The massive red cedars stood like silent, towering sentinels, their lower limbs heavy with rain. Then the tapping stopped. In its place came a different sound. It was a human voice. It came from deep within the thick brush off the left trail, perhaps 30 yards away. It was small, strained, and high-pitched, carried on a gust of wind. "Help. Me." The voice was flat. There was no inflection in it. No rise or fall of breath, no panic or pain. It sounded like an audio clip played back through a tiny metallic speaker. "Help. Me." My chest tightened. "David?" I shouted, swinging my light directly toward the sound. "David Krasner? Stay where you are. I'm coming to you." I stepped off the porch into the icy mud, unfastening the thumb brake on my holster. I took 3 quick paces toward the tree line, the mud sucking at my boots. Then I stopped. Something in my mind, some deep, primal survival instinct that predated logic or professional training, screamed at me to halt. I focused the high lumen beam of my flashlight directly into the thicket where the voice had originated. The light passed through the wet foliage, revealing nothing but tangled salmonberry canes, wet ferns, and the enormous, fluted trunk of an old-growth cedar. And then the voice spoke again. "David. Krasner," it said. It wasn't calling for help anymore. It was repeating the name. But it wasn't using the same voice. It was using my voice. It was my exact tone, my exact cadence, my exact pronunciation from 5 minutes earlier when I had called into the empty tent. "David Krasner? National Park Ranger. Is anyone in there?" Except it was stripped of all human emotion. It sounded like a recording of my own voice played back at slightly lower speed, clipped and unnatural, coming from the shadowed space behind that massive cedar trunk. "Is anyone in there?" My voice repeated from the dark trees. I backed up slowly, step by step, never taking the beam of light off that thicket. My boots slipped in the freezing mud, but I kept my balance, my heart hammering against my ribs with such violence that I could feel it in my throat. As I backed toward the cabin porch, the sound inside the forest changed again. The voice stopped. In its place came a low, wet rustling sound like something very large and very heavy, sliding smoothly through the wet ferns. It wasn't the sound of an animal walking. There was no cadence of 4 legs or 2 legs impacting the ground. It was a continuous, dragging friction against the wet vegetation, moving with horrifying speed parallel to the edge of the clearing. I scrambled back up the wooden steps of the porch, backed through the heavy oak door and slammed it shut, throwing the iron deadbolt into place. I leaned against the heavy wood, my chest heaving, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My flashlight beam trembled against the far wall of the cabin. "Tom?" I jumped. Ray was sitting up in his bunk, squinting through the dim light of the dying stove. "What the hell are you doing?" he asked, rubbing his eyes. "What was that noise?" "Ray," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Did you hear that?" He looked at me, his eyes widening slightly as he saw the expression on my face and the drawn strap of my holster. He slid his legs out of the bunk and stood up, picking up his own flashlight from the bedside table. "Hear what?" I heard the wind blow the door open. "It wasn't the wind," I said, stepping away from the door as if something might push through it at any second. "There's something outside, at the edge of the clearing." Ray walked over to the small window, cleared the condensation from the glass with his palm, and looked out into the storm. He stood there for a long time, his face illuminated by the faint greenish glow of his wristwatch. "There's nothing out there, Tom," he said quietly, though his hand rested firmly on the butt of his sidearm. "It's 3 in the morning in the middle of a gale. The trees are throwing limbs. The wind plays hell with acoustics down in these river bottomlands. It'll make you hear whatever your brain wants to hear." "It used my voice, Ray," I said, looking him dead in the eye. It repeated my exact words back to me. Ray looked at me for a long, silent moment. His expression was a mix of concern, fatigue, and something else, something guarded. He didn't tell me I was crazy. He didn't laugh. He just walked over to the heavy wooden table, pulled out a chair, and sat down. "We go back out at first light," Ray said softly. "We check the tent site again, we file our report, and we get off the river." He didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Neither did I. We sat across from each other at that wooden table while the storm raged outside, listening to the cedar shakes creak above us and the rain lash against the walls. The voice didn't come back that night. The tapping didn't resume. But the silence that settled over the cabin felt dense, intentional, and thick, as if something outside were sitting quietly in the cold mud, listening to us breathe. The next morning broke gray, cold, and exhausted. The storm had passed, leaving behind a fog so thick that you couldn't see 20 yards down the trail. The air smelled of wet earth, rotting vegetation, and crushed pine needles. We hiked back up to the campsite with a 2-man relief team that had managed to push through from the trailhead at dawn. When we arrived at the clearing beneath the giant Sitka spruce, the orange tent was gone. Not collapsed. Not blown away by the wind. Taken. The stakes were still in the ground, pulled cleanly upright as if someone had pulled them straight out of the wet earth. The insulated pad, the sleeping bag, the stove, the half-empty water bladder, everything had vanished. The only thing remaining was the pair of dry hiking boots. They were still sitting side by side on the exact spot where we had found them 18 hours prior. But now they were filled to the brim with cold, clear river water. The search for David Krasner continued for another 10 days. Over 40 search and rescue personnel, K9 units, and specialized tracking teams swept the Queets and canal drainages. They found no trace of him. No clothing, no equipment, no human remains. The tracking dogs refused to cross the small stream near the spruce tree, sitting down in the mud and whining until their handlers turned them back. Eventually, as always happens in the backcountry when winter sets in, the search was suspended. David Krasner was added to the park's long, quiet register of missing persons, another name on a list that stretches back over a century. I requested a transfer to the North District shortly after that, moving my primary base of operations to the ranger station at Storm King, near Lake Crescent. I told myself that I needed a change of scenery, that the low river valleys were too depressing in the winter. But the truth was that I couldn't look at those towering red cedars in the Queets drainage without feeling an overwhelming sense of dread. A cold, nauseating conviction that something was watching me from the green gloom just beyond the line of sight. For almost a month, life returned to a semblance of normality. I processed wilderness permits, maintained public docks, patrolled the paved roads, and dealt with minor infractions. I tried to convince myself that what I had heard that night at the Queets cabin was a psychological anomaly, a combination of exhaustion, environmental stress, and the strange, disorienting acoustics of a narrow mountain valley during a gale. Then, in late November, I met Silas Logan. Silas was a member of the Quinault Indian Nation who had worked for the National Park Service trail maintenance crew for nearly 40 years. He was a quiet, weathered man in his late 60s, with hands like scarred leather and an intimate, unmatched knowledge of every ridge, valley, and dry creek bed on the peninsula. If a trail had been cleared in the last 4 decades, Silas had likely laid the stone or swung the Pulaski that built it. It was a cold, bright Tuesday afternoon, and we were sitting on the back tailgates of our respective service trucks at the trail maintenance yard near Forks, drinking coffee from heavy thermoses while waiting for a supply delivery from Port Angeles. "You were on that search up the Queets last month," Silas said casually, looking out over the yard where heavy equipment sat parked under corrugated metal roofs. "Yeah," I replied, staring down at my black coffee. "I was. Did you find his gear?" "Some of it," I said carefully. "We found his tent initially. Then it wasn't there when the main team came back." Silas took a slow sip of his coffee. He didn't look at me. "Find any boots?" My hand froze on the rim of my thermos cup. I turned my head to look at him. His face was entirely unreadable, etched with deep lines from decades of working outdoors in every kind of weather. "Why do you ask that?" I asked, keeping my voice low. Silas set his thermos down on the bed of his truck. He picked up a small cedar wood chip from the truck bed and began turning it over and over in his rough fingers. "When I was 22, back in '79, Silas said, his voice slow and even, "I was working on a bridge replacement crew up near the headwaters of the Bogachiel. High backcountry. We had a guy on the crew, a kid from Aberdeen named Miller. Good worker. Strong. One afternoon around 4 o'clock the clouds rolled in thick. Standard winter fog. We were packing up our gear at the end of the shift, putting the saws and heavy bars in the lockboxes. Miller said he dropped his wedge pouch about 200 yards back up the draw, said he'd go grab it and meet us at the camp shelter. We waited an hour. He didn't come back, so 3 of us went up the draw with lanterns to look for him." Silas paused. He looked out toward the dark wall of timber that bordered the maintenance yard, his eyes narrowing slightly. "We found his boots," Silas continued, set right in the middle of the trail side by side, dripping wet on the inside like they'd been dipped in the creek. His tin hard hat was sitting about 15 feet up in the fork of a red alder. Nothing else. No tracks in the mud, no torn clothes, no blood. I felt a cold prickle of goosebumps spread down my arms. "Did you ever find him?" "No," Silas said softly. "The park brought in dogs, brought in the state patrol. Nothing. But on the 3rd night of the search, when 4 of us were sitting in the work shelter, we heard someone calling from the timber. I leaned in, my breath catching in my throat. What did it say?" "It called out for the foreman," Silas said. Used his first name. Arthur, come here." But it sounded wrong, like a record playing at the wrong speed. And then it started repeating the safety briefing Arthur had given us that morning, word for word. Same pauses, same cough midway through. Silas turned his head and looked directly at me. His eyes were dark, serious, and entirely devoid of fear or exaggeration. "Did you hear it, Tom?" he asked. I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly dry. "It used my voice, Silas. It repeated what I said when I was calling for Krasner." Silas nodded slowly, as if I had just confirmed a mundane detail about a trail repair estimate. "What is it?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Is it an animal? Some kind of mimic?" Silas looked down at the cedar chip in his hand, then tossed it into the dirt. "My grandfather used to talk about places in the deep timber that don't belong to us," Silas said softly. "Not spirits, not animals, just things that have been in the rain long before people came here. They don't have their own shapes and they don't have their own voices. They take what we leave behind. They take our clothes, our gear, our names. They use them like bait." "Bait for what?" "To pull you off the path," Silas said flatly. "You step off the path into the brush to help someone who sounds like your friend, and then the fog closes in. You wander around in circles for an hour, 20 yards off the trail, but you can't find the dirt anymore. The forest changes shape around you, and then you don't come back." He picked up his thermos, screwed the cap back on with a dry click, and stood up. "If you hear your name out there, Tom," Silas said, looking at me one last time before stepping toward his truck cab, "don't look into the timber, don't answer it, and whatever you do, don't step off the trail." The season rolled on into December. The high passes were completely sealed by 6 feet of heavy, wet cascade snow, closing off the high backcountry for the winter. Most of our work shifted to low-elevation facilities maintenance, snow plowing around the park headquarters, and monitoring storm damage along the coastal strip near La Push and Ruby Beach. On December 14th, a severe winter storm hit the Olympic Peninsula. A massive bomb cyclone stalled off the coast, bringing 90-mile-per-hour wind gusts to the beaches and dropping 4 inches of rain in less than 12 hours across the interior valleys. Trees were coming down everywhere, blocking Highway 101, cutting power lines to local communities, and taking down the park's radio repeater towers. At 3 in the afternoon, while I was clearing fallen by limbs from the road near the Elwha River Bridge, a call came through on the truck's heavy land mobile radio. It was dispatched from Port Angeles, her voice barely audible through heavy static. "Station 3. This is Port Angeles." I grabbed the hand mic. "Port Angeles, this is Station 3, Ranger Vance, go ahead." "Tom," the static hissed, cutting out momentarily. "We have an emergency lock-in at the High Divide. Automatic alarm triggered at the weather telemetry station. Solar battery backup failing. We need someone to check the manual. Emergency generator at the Sol Duke shelter." I frowned into the mic. "Port Angeles, copy that, but the Sol Duke Road is impassable due to blowdown, and the storm is escalating. Heading up to the high shelter right now is extremely hazardous." There was a long pause filled with the ocean-like roar of radio static. When the response came back, the voice sounded strange, faint, distorted, and chopped up by the atmospheric interference. "Imperative. Data link down. Safety hazard for regional aviation. Proceed on foot from the trailhead cabin. Verified generator status. Respond." I hesitated. Going up into the Sol Duke headwaters during a major winter tempest went against every standard safety protocol. But if the regional weather telemetry array was offline, it left pilots flying over the peninsula completely blind to extreme mountain wind shear. "Copy, Port Angeles," I said, rubbing my tired eyes. "I will take the heavy truck as far as the trailhead, check the shelter generator, and report back via radio when complete. Estimated time of return, 6 hours. Copy. Stay on the path." The radio crackled before dying into complete silence. Parked the service truck at the Sol Duke trailhead just before 5 o'clock. The afternoon light had completely failed, swallowed by a deep bruising violet gloom. The wind was screaming through the canopy above, shaking the heavy Douglas firs so violently that large clumps of moss and thick pine branches were raining down onto the roof of the truck. I pulled on my heavy fleece-lined rain parka, buckled my radio harness tightly across my chest, grabbed my heavy-duty search lantern, and loaded my winter pack with emergency shelter gear, extra batteries, and a thermos of hot broth. I checked my sidearm, cleared the holster hood of snow, and stepped out into the tempest. The trail to the Solduke shelter climbs through 4 miles of dense, old-growth timber before breaking out into the subalpine basin below the High Divide. Under normal conditions, it is a broad, well-traveled highway for summertime tourists. In the middle of a December storm in the dark, it was a nightmare. The trail was flooded with running water that reached my ankles, carrying thick mud, gravel, and fallen debris down the mountain. The trees around me groaned continuously, a deep wooden agony as the gale pushed millions of tons of pressure against their roots. Every 50 yards, I had to climb over massive fallen trunks or navigate around root balls that had been ripped cleanly out of the earth, leaving deep, muddy craters in the hillside. I kept my head down, the powerful beam of my lantern cutting a sharp circle through the horizontal rain. I kept Silas's words repeating in my head like a mantra. Stay on the path. Stay on the path. By 7 o'clock, I had reached an elevation of roughly 2,800 feet. The rain was transitioning into a thick, wet snow that stuck to the bark of the trees and coated my parka in a heavy white crust. The wind was even louder here, whistling through the narrow rock chutes of the upper canyon with a sound like a high-pitched siren. Through the whiteout of driving snow, the dark outline of the Solduke shelter appeared. It was a sturdy stone and timber structure, built into the side of the ridge, designed to withstand heavy alpine snow loads. I scrambled up the wet stone steps, pushed open the heavy wooden door, and pulled myself inside, slamming the latch shut against the howl of the storm. The interior of the shelter was freezing, but it was dry. The air smelled of cold stone, old wood smoke, and damp cedar. I unclipped my pack, leaned against the stone wall, and took a long drink from my thermos, my hands shaking from physical exertion and cold. I pulled my radio from its harness and keyed the mic. Port Angeles dispatch. This is Ranger Vance at the Solduke shelter. Do you copy? Static. Nothing but a harsh, continuous hiss. Port Angeles dispatch. This is Vance. I am at the shelter. Proceeding to inspect the telemetry generator panel. Over. Silence. The radio repeater on the peak above was clearly dead, knocked out by the storm or choked off by the heavy snow layer. I was completely isolated. I pulled my headlamp down over my wool cap, stepped over to the utility closet at the rear of the shelter, and unlatched the steel door. Inside sat the gray electrical junction box and the automated diesel generator unit that powered the park's weather monitoring sensors on the ridge above. I opened the box. The circuit breakers were tripped, but the digital display on the battery array was lit up green. The system hadn't failed due to a mechanical breakdown. The emergency shutoff switch had been physically pulled down into the off position. I stood staring at the switch. To pull that switch, someone had to open the outer wooden door of the shelter, step inside, open the steel utility panel, and manually throw the heavy iron lever down. I slowly reached out and pushed the lever back up into the engaged position. The generator clicked twice, its small engine coughing to life with a quiet, muffled hum that filled the stone room. The indicator lights on the telemetry panel flipped from red to steady green. The system was functional. I turned around, my heart beginning to pick up its rhythm, and looked back toward the main room of the shelter. The heavy front door, the door I had slammed and latched shut 3 minutes earlier, was wide open. It swung slowly on its iron hinges, banging against the outer stone wall with a dull, rhythmic thud as the wind caught it. Thud, thud, thud. Heavy, wet snow was blowing straight through the opening, dusting the concrete floor with a white sheet. I drew my Glock, holding it low at my side, and stepped slowly toward the open doorway. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice tight. No answer. Only the roar of the gale ripping across the ridge and the hum of the generator behind me. I reached the threshold, grabbed the edge of the heavy wooden door, and prepared to pull it shut. That was when I looked down at the snow on the porch steps. Leading up the steps, straight from the dark timber off the main trail and into the shelter, were footsteps. They were not boot prints. They were broad, flat, impressionless shapes in the wet slush, as if someone had taken heavy lengths of wet wood and pressed them hard into the snow. And leading out of the shelter, heading back down toward the dense timber of the creek draw, was a single long, Smooth trough dragging through the snow, a wide, continuous mark, like something heavy being pulled smoothly through the drift. And right in the middle of the shelter floor, sitting in the dry spot where the snow hadn't reached, was a small object. I lowered my flashlight and focused the light on it. It was my own spare radio battery, the one I had left inside the glove compartment of my service truck, 4 miles down the mountain, locked behind steel doors. My blood ran completely cold. A wave of ice seemed to spill down my spine, turning my limbs heavy and numb. It had been at my truck. While I was hiking up the trail, it had been at my vehicle. Then, from the dark, snow-choked valley below the shelter, from the bottom of the steep, timbered draw where the creek roared over the rocks, a sound came up through the storm. It was a voice. It was loud, clear, and perfectly articulated, echoing off the stone walls of the amphitheater behind the shelter. It was the voice of Sarah Lindqvist, the seasonal tech who was currently on duty 40 miles away at the Port Angeles station. "Tom," her voice called out, filled with urgent, desperate panic. "Tom, help me! I slipped off the bridge. My leg is pinned. Tom!" It sounded identical to her. The panic in her breath, the high, strained pitch of her voice, it was a masterclass in human terror. "Tom, please, I'm down by the creek. I can't get up." I gripped the frame of the door, my knuckles turning white. My mind screamed at me to run down the slope, to jump off the wooden stairs and throw myself into the dark brush to save her. Every human instinct I possessed, every ounce of my ranger training, demanded that I react to that scream. And then I remembered Silas. They don't have their own shapes. They don't have their own voices. They take what we leave behind. I looked down at the spare radio battery sitting on the cold concrete floor. Sarah wasn't down by the creek. Sarah was 40 miles away in a heated dispatch office. I stepped back inside the shelter. I reached out, grabbed the handle of the heavy oak door, pulled it shut with all my strength, and threw the iron deadbolt into place. The moment the bolt clicked into its iron sleeve, the voice outside stopped. Instantly. There was no fade, no dying echo. It was as if someone had abruptly pressed a stop button on a tape deck. For 3 seconds, there was total silence outside, a silence so sudden and absolute that even the sound of the wind, storm, seemed to drop away into nothingness. Then came the impact. Slam. Something heavy, something immense, hit the outer wall of the stone shelter with such force that the heavy peeled log rafters shook above me. Mortar dust rained down from the ceiling, dusting my shoulders with white powder. I stumbled back, raising my firearm with both hands, aiming it directly at the heavy wooden door. Slam. The door groaned in its frame. The iron hinges bent inward slightly, the thick oak planks cracking down the center seam. The smell that instantly flooded through the thin cracks of the wood was not the fresh scent of winter snow or pine. It was an appalling ancient stench, the smell of stagnant river mud, rotting vegetation, wet fur, and decay. "Tom," a voice whispered. It wasn't Sarah's voice anymore. It wasn't my voice. It was a voice composed of dozens of voices overlaid on top of one another. A terrible, discordant chorus of men and women, speaking in perfect unison from the other side of the wood. "Tom, open the door." I didn't answer. I couldn't speak. My chest was crushed by a terror so absolute, so suffocating, that my throat completely closed up. I stood there in the dark shelter, illuminated only by the faint green light of the generator panel, my gun trembling in my grip, pointing at that cracking wooden door. Slam. A gap opened in the upper plank of the door. A long, thin, pale object slid through the narrow crack. It was not a hand. It looked like a long, jointless length of dense gray rootwood, smooth and hairless, slick with wet river slime. It reached inward, moving with a slow, blind, searching motion, feeling along the inner frame of the door toward the iron deadbolt. I didn't think. I acted on pure animal survival instinct. I squeezed the trigger of my Glock. The gunshot in that enclosed stone space was deafening. A blinding flash of light and an explosive crack that shattered my hearing. The bullet struck the wooden door frame right beside the reaching limb, tearing off a large spray of oak splinters. The limb pulled back through the crack with incredible speed, sliding out into the darkness like a worm retreating into soil. Outside, a sound rose up into the night. It was not a roar. It was not an animal scream. It was a long, low, descending tone like a massive wooden pipe organ losing air pressure, a sound that vibrated straight through the stone floor of the shelter and into the bones of my feet. Then came the sound of movement. It didn't walk away, it slid. A heavy, wet, continuous dragging sound that moved up the vertical stone face of the ridge above the shelter, moving at a speed that no human or known animal could ever achieve on sheer rock, until the sound faded out into the roaring gale high above the tree line. I stayed in that shelter for 11 hours. I didn't sit down. I didn't lower my firearm. I stood in the center of the room, my back pressed against the metal casing of the humming generator, my eyes fixed on that cracked wooden door, watching the white snow blow through the narrow gap. The storm raged all through the night, but nothing else came down from the ridge. No voices called out from the dark. No tapping sounded on the stone walls. When the first gray light of dawn finally filtered through the high, small window of the shelter, the wind had died down to a low, quiet breeze. I unlatched the damaged door, pushing it open with my boot. The world outside was transformed. A fresh layer of pristine, blinding white snow covered the ridge, smoothing over the chaotic damage of the storm. I looked at the stone porch. The long, continuous dragging mark that had led away from the shelter was almost entirely filled with new snow. But high up on the sheer basalt cliff face behind the structure, a vertical wall of rock 30 feet high, slick with ice, were long, deep grooves scraped into the bare stone, where the ice had been stripped away by something pulling itself straight up into the high peaks. I didn't complete my patrol. I didn't log the incident on the shelter's physical clipboard. I packed my gear, turned off my radio, and walked down that mountain. I didn't stop to rest. I didn't look back into the heavy timber off the sides of the trail. I kept my eyes fixed on the muddy dirt path ahead of me, stepping through the fallen debris, until I reached my service truck at the trailhead. When I reached Port Angeles that afternoon, I walked into the chief ranger's office, handed him my keys, my badge, and my service weapon, and submitted my immediate resignation. He was shocked. He asked me what had happened, why I was bleeding from a deep wood splinter scratch on my face, why my hands were shaking so violently that I couldn't sign the resignation paperwork properly. I told him I was burnt out. I told him the winter weather had finally gotten to me, that I was moving back east to live near my family in Ohio. I never mentioned the Saul Duke shelter. I never mentioned the radio battery sitting on the concrete floor. I never mentioned the dry boots in the open door of David Krasner's tent. It has been 15 years since that night. I live in a small dry town in Arizona now, a landscape of flat sand, low scrub brush, and wide open sky where you can see for 20 miles in every direction. There are no forests here. There are no towering trees that shut out the daylight, no carpets of wet moss, no continuous heavy rain to drown out the sounds of the night. But I still don't like to go outside after sunset, and sometimes, when a summer wind blows across the flat desert, carrying the faint sound of a distant coyote or the hum of traffic from the highway, I catch myself freezing in place, straining my ears toward the dark. Because in the back of my mind I am always waiting. I'm waiting for the day when the wind shifts, the air turns cold and wet, and I hear a voice calling my name from the edge of the dark, speaking in a voice I know all too well, repeating words I thought I had left behind in the rain. If you've ever stood alone in the middle of 300,000 acres of commercial spruce forest, while the frost sets into the moss, you know there's a specific kind of silence that doesn't feel like peace. It feels like an interruption. I spent 12 years learning the difference between a forest that was resting and a forest that was holding its breath. People around Bangor and Millinocket just called me Vance. But my full name is Thomas Arthur Vance, and back in the fall of 2016, I was a 38-year-old backcountry ranger with the Maine Bureau of Parks and Lands. I was stationed up near the Chamberlain Lake District, a region of timberland so vast and isolated that the mapmakers stopped giving towns names over a century ago, assigning them township numbers like T7R11 Wells instead. That autumn was dry and bitter. By late October, the black frost had locked the bogs into concrete, but there wasn't an inch of snow to soften the woods. The trees were dead quiet, stripped of their leaves, standing like gray iron rods against a sky the color of tin. My job during those weeks was mostly solitary. Peak tourist season was long dead. The float planes had stopped bringing in summer fishermen, and the deer hunters hadn't yet flooded the tote roads with their pickup trucks. It was that liminal stretch of year where the North Woods belonged entirely to the caretakers, the loggers, and whatever lived beneath the thick mats of balsam needle duff. My station was a 2-room log cabin built by the Civilian Conservation Corps back in the 1930s, perched on a gravel spit near the Telos Dam. It had a wood stove, a propane stove for cooking, a diesel generator that ran 3 hours a night to charge my battery banks, and a 2-way VHF radio setup connected to a 100-foot guide antenna. On the ridge behind the woodshed, my closest regular contact was Dave Miller, a chief warden stationed down at Rapogenis Gorge, 30 miles south over dirt roads that would break a truck's suspension if you took them faster than 15 miles an hour. It started on a Tuesday, the 25th of October. I had taken the station's green Ford F-250 out to clear blowdown along the old tote road that cut west toward Eagle Lake. The wind had blown hard from the northwest 2 nights prior, snapping dry balsam firs like toothpick wood across the right-of-way. I had my Husqvarna chainsaw in the bed, along with a pair of axes, a winch, and my standard gear. The sun was low, hanging like a dull brass coin over the ridge, and the thermometer on my dash read 22 degrees Fahrenheit. Around 3 in the afternoon, I stopped near the crossing of Deadman Brook. The brook wasn't much more than a trickle through a field of moss-covered granite boulders, but the culvert under the road was old, made of stacked cedar logs from the late 1800s. I killed the truck engine to check the culvert for beaver dams. When the rumble of the V8 died away, the silence hit me like a physical object. In the North Woods, silence isn't usually absolute. You hear the creak of spruce limbs rubbing together in the upper canopy, the dry rattle of beech leaves hanging on for winter, the scuttle of red squirrels in the brush, or the far-off drone of a logging truck grinding down the Golden Road 10 miles away. But here, standing by the tailboard of my truck, there was nothing. No wind, no birds, no water. Even the trickle of Deadman Brook seemed to have vanished, though I could see the water moving dark and clear over the stones 10 feet below me. I walked down into the ditch to clear a handful of floating birch twigs from the culvert intake. As I leaned over, I felt a sudden sharp pressure in my inner ears, the exact sensation you get when an airplane descends too quickly or when a storm front drops the barometric pressure in a matter of seconds. I pulled my gloves off and rubbed my ears, swallowing hard to pop them. Nothing changed. The pressure remained heavy and dense, like I was swimming at the bottom of a cold quarry. That was when I noticed the cedar trees along the bank of the brook. Northern white cedar is common up there. It grows twisted and tough along the watercourses, its gray bark shredding in long, fibrous ribbons. But these trees, a cluster of 4 or 5 large trunks growing out of a single root mass near the culvert mouth, didn't look right. The bark had been stripped away completely from the ground up to a height of about 10 feet. It hadn't been peeled by a moose or chewed by porcupines. There were no tooth marks, no vertical scrapes from antlers, no ragged edges. The wood beneath was bare, polished, and completely dry. It was as white as bone, but smooth, almost as if someone had spent days working over the grain with fine sandpaper and a cabinet scraper. I stepped closer and touched the bare trunk with my thumb. Cedar wood, even dead cedar, usually has a coarse, oily feel to it. This wood was powdery. A fine white dust coated my thumb, a dust that smelled faintly of old turpentine and dry earth with no scent of cedar sap left at all. I drew my work knife and pressed the point into the wood. Normally, cedar is soft enough that a sharp blade will sink a 1/4 inch into the grain with light hand pressure. The blade didn't penetrate. It bounced off with a dull, hollow clack like I'd struck a sheet of cured oak or petrified bone. Strange, I muttered to myself. My voice sounded wrong. It didn't carry. It dropped straight out of my mouth and fell into the moss at my boots, flat and dead, without a trace of natural resonance or echo. It was like speaking inside an insulated recording booth lined with thick wool blankets. I stepped back toward the truck, feeling a sudden, inexplicable prickle of cold sweat along the back of my neck. I've lived in Maine my entire life. I've tracked wounded black bears into cedar swamps in the dark. I've ridden out gale-force blizzards on lake ice, and I've never been a jumpy man. But standing in that ditch with my ears throbbing under that unnatural pressure, and my own voice sounding like a dead croak, a primitive part of my brain started beating a rhythm that said, "Move." I got back into the F-250, turned the key and let the engine idle while I wrote down the coordinates in my logbook. 7R11 Sector 4 Deadman Brook Culvert, Cedar trunks calcified, stripped, acoustic anomaly. I drove back to the Telos cabin as the dusk turned the sky from gray to a deep, bruising purple. That evening, around 7, I turned on the generator and fired up the VHF radio to do my evening check-in with Warden Dave Miller down at Ripogenus. Rip 1. This is Telos Station, over, I said into the microphone. Static crackled through the speaker, heavy with atmospheric noise, before Dave's dry, gravelly voice cut through. Telos Station, Rip 1. Go ahead, Tom. Just wrapping up for the night, Dave. Cleared 3 blowdowns on the Eagle Lake tote. Roads open to the 4-mile marker. Everything's quiet up here. Cold as a brass doorknob. Copy that, Tom, Dave replied. Listen, you had any private vehicles pass your gate today? We got a call from a woman down in Bangor. Her husband was supposed to be back yesterday from a 3-day solitary fly fishing trip up on the Webster Stream stretch. Name's Arthur Pendleton. 62 years old. Drives an old beige Subaru Outback. I reached for my gate ledger, flipping back through the handwritten pages. Hold on a second, Dave. I ran my finger down the column for Sunday. Yeah, I got him. Arthur Pendleton. Checked in Sunday morning at 6:15. Destination listed as Webster Outlet Lean-To. He hasn't checked out through Telos. All right, Dave said, his tone shifting into his professional warden voice. His wife says he knows the area like his own backyard. Used to be a cruiser for Great Northern Paper back in the 80s. But he's 62 and he's got a bad heart. If he isn't out by morning, we're going to have to launch a ground search. Can you ride down to the Webster Outlet Lean-To first thing at first light? See if his car's still at the turnaround? Will do, I said. I'll head out at 6. Hey Dave, quick question for you. Go for Telos. You ever see cedar trees up around Deadman Brook get stripped bone white and turn hard as iron? Like all the oil and moisture was pulled right out of them? There was a long pause on the line. The static surged and faded. Sound like distant surf rolling over river stones. Deadman Brook? Dave said finally. Can't say I have, Tom. Moose'll peel hemlock and mountain ash in the winter, but they leave cedar alone unless they're starving. And even then, they leave teeth marks. Why? Just came across a patch today, I said, leaning back in my chair and looking out the cabin window into the jet-black wall of trees beyond the clearing. Felt strange down in that dip. Acoustic was real flat. Ears popped. Dave snorted through the speaker. Barometric pressure's dropping, Tom. Weather Service says we got a hard cold front sliding down from Quebec tonight. It does funny things to the air in those low bogs. Get some sleep. Let me know what you find at Webster Outlet in the morning. Copy that, Rip 1 out. I shut off the generator at 9. The sudden darkness in the cabin was total, filled only with the orange glow of the wood stove grates. I laid in my bunk with my wool blankets pulled up to my chin, listening to the cabin settle. The logs groaned as the cold contracted the timber. Outside, the night was dead quiet. No wind, no coyotes, no owls. Just that heavy, expectant silence stretching out across hundreds of miles of frozen timber. I fell asleep around midnight, but my sleep was thin and full of strange fragments of dreams. I dreamed I was standing at the edge of a vast frozen lake that had no far shore. In the dream, someone was calling my name, but the sound wasn't coming through the air. It was coming from inside the ice under my feet, a low, dry, scraping sound like a heavy wooden box being dragged across rough cedar planks. I woke up at 5 in the morning, an hour before my alarm. The temperature inside the cabin had dropped to 40 degrees. The fire in the stove had died down to a handful of dull gray embers. I pulled on my insulated Carhartt pants, my wool shirt, and my heavy winter boots, then rebuilt the fire until the iron stovepipe roared red hot. By 6, I was in the F-250, heading east toward the Webster Stream watershed. The stars were out, bright, hard points of ice pinned against a black velvet sky. The headlights cut through the frost fog rising from the gravel road, casting long, swaying shadows into the spruce thickets on either side. The turnoff for Webster Outlet was an old Winter Hall road, unmaintained by the state and choked with young birch saplings that scraped against the sides of the truck. I bounced along for 2 miles until the road terminated in a small turnaround surrounded by tall, dark red spruces. There was a vehicle parked in the center of the clearing, a beige Subaru Outback, coated in a thick layer of white hoarfrost. I pulled up next to it, set my parking brake, and got out with my heavy Maglite flashlight. I shone the beam through the Subaru's windows. The car was empty. A sleeping bag was neatly rolled in the back cargo area alongside an ice chest and a folding camp chair. On the front passenger seat lay an open topo map of the Chamberlain Quadrangle and an uneaten turkey sandwich wrapped in wax paper. "Mr. Pendleton?" I called out, my voice cutting into the crisp morning air. No answer. The sound of my voice echoed faintly off the wall of spruces across the turnaround. A normal, healthy echo. That made me feel a little better. I walked to the edge of the turnaround where the foot trail led down to the Webster Stream lean-to, about a quarter mile through the timber. The trail was covered in a carpet of frozen spruce needles. I knelt down with my flashlight and examined the ground. Frost made tracking easy if you knew what to look for. I could clearly see the lugged soles of a pair of heavy hiking boots pressed into the frost-crusted soil, pointing down the trail toward the stream. I unclipped my radio from my belt. "Rip one, this is Tello Station, over, static." Then Dave's voice, weak and thin through the mountains. "Go ahead, Tom. I'm at the Webster turnaround. Pendleton's vehicle is here. Looks like he hiked down to the stream with his gear. I'm following his tracks on foot now. I'll report back when I reach the shelter." 10-4, Tom. Watch your step. Warden Service is assembling a team down at the gatehouse just in case. I clipped the radio back to my chest strap, grabbed my ranger pack from the cab, which contained a first aid kit, emergency rations, a throw rope, and a satellite locator beacon, and started down the foot trail. The air was bitterly cold, freezing the moisture in my nostrils with every breath. The sky was just beginning to lighten in the east, turning from black to a pale, cold gray. As I walked, the silence of the woods settled back over me, but it was the normal silence of an autumn morning. I heard a red squirrel chatter angrily from the top of a dead cedar, and 100 yards away, a crow cawed twice before flapping south over the canopy. Then I reached the stream basin. Webster Stream at that point was 50 yards wide, flowing cold and dark between banks choked with gray granite boulders and dense thickets of alder and northern white cedar. The lean-to, a 3-sided shelter built of peeled spruce logs, with an open front facing the water, sat on a high knoll overlooking a deep pool. I climbed the knoll and pulled back the heavy tarp that hung across the front of the shelter to keep out the wind. "Mr. Pendleton?" I said. The shelter was empty. A wool blanket was laid out over a sleeping pad, and a cold camp stove sat on a timber bench next to a mess kit. But Mr. Pendleton wasn't there. I stepped back out into the open and swung my flashlight beam around the clearing. His foot tracks were visible again, leading away from the lean-to down the steep bank toward the edge of the stream. I followed them down. The frost was heavy on the rocks near the water's edge. I could see where his boots had slipped on an icy stone, leaving a dark smear on the gray granite. The tracks led straight to the edge of a large flat ledge that jutted out into the current. On top of the ledge sat his fly fishing gear. A graphite fly rod was leaning against a boulder, its line stripped out and tangled in a mass of frozen monofilament around the reel. Next to the rod was a heavy tackle bag, unzipped, with fly boxes scattered across the rock, and beside the tackle bag sat his boots. I stopped dead in my tracks. They were heavy, insulated leather hunting boots, standing upright on the flat rock side by side, perfectly neat, as if someone had carefully placed them there before stepping into the river. "Arthur?" I yelled, my voice ringing out over the rush of the water. I hurried onto the ledge and knelt beside the boots. They weren't empty. I reached out and touched the collar of the left boot. It was rigid. I shone my flashlight down into the shaft. The boot wasn't filled with a foot or a sock. It was filled to the brim with a dense packed column of white, powdery wood dust, the exact same dry, chalky powder I had found on the stripped cedar trees at Deadman Brook 24 hours earlier. I recoiled, pulling my hand back as if I'd touched a copperhead. "What the hell?" I muttered. I picked up the boot by the leather loop at the heel. It was light, impossibly light. It weighed no more than the leather itself. I tipped it over. A thick stream of the white powder poured out onto the gray granite rock, forming a small pale mound in the dim morning light. Mixed into the powder were 3 small hard items that clinked softly as they struck the stone. I leaned closer with my flashlight. They were brass eyelets and metal lace hooks, completely detached from any leather, completely bare, and among them was a small round gold ring, a wedding band, tarnished and dull, resting in the center of the white dust. My heart began to hammer against my ribs like a trapped bird. My breath came in short, white gasps. I looked at the water. Webster Stream was dark, clear, and 4 feet deep off the edge of the ledge. The current was steady, but not fast enough to carry away a grown man without leaving a trace. There was no body in the pool. There were no tracks leaving the ledge on the far side. There were no drag marks, no blood, no signs of a struggle. Just those 2 upright boots filled with powdery white dust and a gold ring. I reached for my VHF radio with a trembling hand. "Rip 1, this is Telos Station. Emergency message over." I practically yelled into the mic static. A long, agonizing wall of pink noise. "Rip 1. Dave, do you copy?" "Over." Through the static, a sound began to bleed in. It wasn't Dave's voice. It wasn't the rhythmic click of atmospheric interference. It was a sound like 2 dry, hollow logs being rubbed together under immense pressure. A rhythmic, dragging scrape that seemed to pulse through the speaker in time with a low, dry whistling sound. It sounded like winter wind blowing through a narrow crack in a dead pine snag. But it was structured, almost deliberate, rising and falling in unnatural cadences. Then from the woods across the stream, less than 50 yards away in the dense cedar swamp, I heard it, not through the radio speaker, through the cold, silent air. It was my own voice. It echoed back across the water, perfectly crisp, carrying every nuance of my panic, but flat and dry, stripped of all human warmth. "Rip 1. Dave, do you copy?" "Over." I froze. The hair on my arm stood up so hard it pained my skin beneath my wool sleeve. I slowly stood up on the granite ledge, turning my body toward the far bank of the stream. The morning light was stronger now, a sickly gray illumination seeping through the spruce canopy. Across the water, the cedar trees stood thick and tangled, their roots reaching into the dark river like gray, skeletal fingers. Nothing moved. There was no wind. The water rippled quietly against the rocks. Then, about 20 yards back into the gloom of the far swamp, I saw the trunk of an ancient white pine. It was massive, 4 feet in diameter, dead and barkless, standing tall among the smaller spruces. As I watched, the trunk moved. It didn't sway in the breeze. It shifted laterally, 6 inches to the left, with a dry, heavy thud that vibrated through the granite beneath my boots. My eyes strained against the dim light, trying to make sense of what I was looking at. It wasn't a tree trunk, it was a tall, unnaturally long limb. A pillar of dead, bone-white calcified wood, ribbed and contoured like the bark of a weathered pine, but smooth and jointed like an elongated, twisted human arm. It was rising from the deep moss behind the spruce thicket, extending upward 12, 15, 18 feet into the lower canopy. And beside it, another pale column shifted out from behind a stand of balsam firs. The pressure in my ears came back with terrifying force. The sound of the rushing stream instantly vanished, not faded, but cut off as cleanly as if someone had flipped a switch on an audio board. The forest went violently, absolutely silent. The air pressure dropped so low that my mouth went dry in a single second, and the skin across my face felt pulled tight over my cheekbones. From between the 2 pale columns of petrified wood, something turned toward me. It had no eyes, no nose, no mouth in any human sense. What appeared to be a face was simply a smooth, hollowed knot in the center of a massive, elongated torso, made of layered resinous cambium and dead pine heartwood. The knot was dark, a deep, empty cavity that seemed to drink the pale morning light. Around the edges of that hollow knot, the bare petrified wood was scarred with long, smooth grooves, the same grooves I had seen on the cedar trees at Dead Man Brook. And then, from deep inside that dry, hollow knot, the air was drawn inward with a sharp, wheezing hiss, like a blacksmith's bellows pulling air through a dry leather valve. The voice came out of that hollow space. It wasn't a vocal sound. It was the mechanical friction of dry wooden surfaces grinding together, shaping air into phonemes through sheer acoustic mimicry. "Thomas." It didn't say my title. It didn't say Vance. It said my first name in the exact voice of my dead father, who had been buried in a cemetery in Brewer 8 years prior. "Thomas, come clear the blowdown." A wave of nausea hit me so hard my knees buckled. I dropped my flashlight onto the rock. It rolled into the dark water of the stream with a small splash that made no sound at all in the deadened air. I didn't think. I didn't pull my sidearm. I didn't call back into the radio. Every instinct that has kept human beings alive since we slept in caves grabbed me by the back of the neck and pulled me backwards off that ledge. I scrambled up the steep bank on my hands and knees, tearing my gloves on the frozen briars, digging my fingers into the cold dirt. I ran up the foot trail toward the turnaround like a blind man running through a fire. Every step felt heavy, like running underwater. The pressure in my ears was deafening, a high-pitched, ringing whine that buzzed in the center of my skull. Behind me, I could hear the woods coming apart. It wasn't the sound of an animal crashing through brush. It was the heavy, rhythmic thunk, thunk, thunk of immense weight dropping onto frozen ground, accompanied by the dry, splintering crack of 20-foot spruce trees being sheared off at the root without a breath of wind to push them. And above the cracking timber, that dry, hollow whistling sound rose in pitch, echoing from 3 different directions at once. Rip 1. Dave. Do you copy, Thomas? Come clear the blowdown. I burst out of the tree line into the turnaround. My truck was standing there, cold and solid. A piece of manufactured steel from a world that suddenly felt 1,000,000 miles away. I lunged for the driver's side door, yanked it open, threw myself inside and slammed the lock down. My hands were shaking so violently I couldn't get the key into the ignition on the first 2 tries. I dropped the keys onto the floorboard, screamed a curse, snatched them up, and jammed the key into the slot. The V8 engine roared to life. I threw the truck into reverse, smashed my foot onto the gas pedal, and backed out of the turnaround so fast the rear tires kicked up a shower of frozen gravel that hammered against the underside of the bed. I spun the wheel, shoved the selector into drive, and tore down the abandoned Winter Hall Road, saplings whipping against the windshield like tiny green whips. As I crossed the boundary line out of the Webster Stream drainage, about a mile down the road, the pressure in my ears suddenly snapped. Pop. The sound of the truck's engine, the roaring heater, the gravel rattling in the wheel wells, and the wind whistling around the side mirrors crashed back into my consciousness with the force of a physical blow. I pulled the truck over onto the shoulder of the main tote road, shoved the transmission into park, and vomited into my lap. I sat there for 20 minutes, shivering uncontrollably, my chest heaving, staring into the rear-view mirror at the empty, frozen gravel road stretching back into the dark spruces. Nothing followed me out onto the main road. The woods sat there under the brightening gray morning sky, silent, motionless. Fast when I finally pulled myself together enough to operate the radio, I called Warden Dave Miller. Dave, I said, my voice crackling with raw terror. Tom, where the hell have you been? I've been trying to raise you for 45 minutes. Did you find Pendleton? I stared at the dashboard. My knuckles were white where I was gripping the steering wheel. I found his car, I said slowly, forcing each word through my teeth. I found his gear at the stream. Is he down? Dave, send the state police. Send the tactical team. Don't send game wardens alone. Tell them we have an active secondary threat in the timber at Webster Outlet. Tell them to bring heavy gear. Tom, what are you talking about? What's at Webster Outlet? He's gone, Dave, I whispered into the mic. Arthur's gone. There's nothing left of him but his boots and his ring. The investigation that followed was a slow, bureaucratic nightmare that lasted 3 weeks. The Maine State Police sent down a major crimes unit, along with 24 game wardens, search and rescue dog teams, and tactical personnel equipped with thermal imaging drones. They set up a command post at the Telus Gatehouse. I spent 6 hours being interrogated in the back of a mobile command RV by 2 detectives from Augusta. They sat across from me with a digital voice recorder running between us, staring at me with cold, skeptical eyes while I told them what I had found on the granite ledge. I didn't tell them about the pale columns. I didn't tell them about the dry, hollow knot, or my dead father's voice coming out of the swamp, or the deadened air. I knew how that would go. If I said those words out loud to 2 state police detectives in a heated trailer, I wouldn't be standing there as a park ranger. I'd be sitting in a psychiatric evaluation holding room at Eastern Maine Medical Center in Bangor, stripped of my badge and my gun. So I told them the facts that could be proven. I told them I found Pendleton's gear, his standing boots filled with wood dust, his ring, and that I heard large blowdown trees collapsing across the stream, which made me fear a localized landslide or an aggressive brown bear, forcing me to fall back. They searched the Webster Stream drainage for 5 days. The search dogs refused to cross the stream. The handlers, seasoned state troopers with years of K-9 experience, couldn't get the German shepherds within 50 yards of the water. The dogs laid down in the frost, whining, tucking their tails between their legs, and clawing at the dirt to pull themselves backward toward the turnaround. The thermal drones flew over the cedar swamp for 3 nights straight. They found nothing. No heat signatures, no movement, no sign of human remains. On the 4th day, a team of troopers found Arthur Pendleton's fly rod, his tackle box, and his boots right where I had left them. They bagged the white powder from inside the boots and sent it down to the State Police Crime Lab in Augusta for forensic analysis. A week later, the report came back. The white powder was pure, unrefined cellulose and petrified pine lignin, completely devoid of organic cellular moisture, crushed to a particle size of less than 10 microns. There was no human DNA present in the powder. None. Arthur Pendleton was officially listed as a missing person, presumed dead by wilderness exposure or drowning, despite his body never being recovered. His beige Subaru was towed out of the woods and turned over to his wife. The Bureau of Parks and Lands gave me 2 weeks of administrative leave. I spent those 2 weeks in my small apartment in Old Town, sitting in the living room with all the lights turned on, listening to the drone of a white noise machine I'd bought at a local pharmacy. I couldn't stand quiet rooms anymore. If the apartment went silent for more than a minute, my ears would start ringing, and I'd feel that horrifying drop in air pressure creeping up the back of my neck. During those 2 weeks, I did what any man in my position would do. I tried to find answers in history. I drove down to the Bangor Public Library and spent 3 days sitting in the local history archive, digging through late 19th century logging journals, Great Northern Paper Company land surveys, and microfilmed copies of old county newspapers from the 1880s and 1890s. That was where I found the journals of Silas Vance. No relation to me as far as I know, but a chief timber cruiser who worked the Upper Penobscot and Allagash watersheds between 1878 and 1894. His handwritten logbooks were bound in cracked black leather, filled with neat, spidery cursive written in iron gall ink. In an entry dated November 12, 1886, written near the Chamberlain Farm Logging Depot, Silas Vance wrote, "The drives are finished for the season, but the men are fearful of entering the virgin white pine stands along the Webster Deadwater. 3 river drivers from the Bangor Company, Frenchmen from Madawaska, went into the timber on Thursday to stake a new haul road. Only one returned to camp, and he has lost his tongue to terror. He claims they entered a patch of timber where the air was as dead as a sealed tomb, and the timber itself was bone white and hard as iron ore. He says the trees did not rustle in the gale, but stood still and whistled through their knots in the voices of men who drowned on the West Branch Drive 3 years past. When we went out with 6 armed men to seek the missing drivers, we found their axes wedged into a pine trunk. Their wool coats and leather boots were standing upright in the moss near the marsh edge, filled to the collars with dry white pine meal, as if their flesh and bone had been drawn out through the pores of their clothes by some terrible dry suction. We burned the stand to the roots on Saturday, but the fire would not take to the white trees. The flames died in the air 10 feet before reaching the bark, as if the air itself lacked the damp to burn. God save the men who cruise these woods when the virgin timber is gone, for what lives in the heart of the old growth does not die when the tree is felled. It moves into the earth and it waits for the air to grow dry." I closed the journal. My hands were ice cold. I resigned from the Maine Bureau of Parks and Lands the following month in December 2016. I turned in my badge, my radio, my keys, and my uniform shirts. Dave Miller tried to talk me out of it. He thought I was suffering from delayed post-traumatic stress from finding Pendleton's gear, but I didn't care what he thought. I packed my belongings into my truck and moved west to New Hampshire, taking a job with a private civil engineering firm doing highway survey work along the interstate corridors. It's been 8 years since that morning on Webster Stream. I live in a suburban neighborhood now, surrounded by streetlights, paved roads, and the constant, comforting hum of highway traffic half a mile away. I keep 3 television sets running in my house 24 hours a day, one in the living room, one in the kitchen, one in my bedroom, just to keep the air filled with human sound. I don't go hiking. I don't camp. I don't buy wooden furniture, and I cut down the 2 small ornamental maple trees in my front yard the day after I closed on the house. People think I'm eccentric. My neighbors laugh when they see me out in my yard at 2 in the morning. checking the weather station I installed on my garage roof to make sure the barometric pressure isn't dropping too fast. I let them laugh, because I know what's sitting up there in T7R11, deep in the North Maine woods beyond the reach of paved roads and streetlights. It isn't an animal. It isn't a demon or a ghost or a fairy tale from a book. It's something far older, a remnant of the ancient virgin forest that stood on this continent before human beings ever brought an axe to wood. A parasite of sap and calcified fiber that feeds on the moisture, the sound and the breath of living things, drawing them down into dead pine dust until there's nothing left to bury, and the worst part, the thing that keeps me awake at night while the televisions drone in my dark house, is what happened last autumn. I was sitting on my porch in New Hampshire on a quiet Tuesday evening in October. The air was dry and crisp, and the wind was coming out of the north. For just a fraction of a second, the traffic noise on the interstate died away. The air pressure in my outer ears gave a small, distinct click, and from the decorative cedar hedge at the edge of my neighbor's driveway, 30 feet away in the suburban dark, I heard a sound like dry wooden boards dragging across gravel. Then came a voice, flat, dry and hollow, mimicking the exact tone of my dead father, carried on a breath of warm air that smelled of old turpentine and bone-dry pine. "Thomas, come clear the blowdown." If you've ever stood on the volcanic rim of the Black Range at 3 in the morning, when the desert wind completely drops, you know the kind of quiet I'm talking about. It isn't just an absence of noise, it's a physical weight, like dry wool pressed hard against your eardrums, thick enough to make your heart sound like a bass drum inside your chest. I spent 11 years wearing the green and tan uniform of the United States Forest Service, and for the longest time, I believed I knew every square mile of that silence. My name is something I rarely drop in casual conversation these days, but if you're going to understand what happened out there, you need to know who was standing in those boots. I'm Jesse Callahan. I was 42 years old back in the long, parched summer of 2008. Working as a senior backcountry patrol ranger assigned to the Gila Wilderness in southwestern New Mexico. Up until that season, my life was measured in very predictable, tangible things: clearing windfall trees off the Continental Divide Trail, checking fire permits, mapping box canyons, and pulling dehydrated tourists out of dry washes when they vastly underestimated how fast high desert elevation will wring the moisture straight out of a human body. It was hard, honest work, and I loved the solitary nature of it. The Gila is 750,000 acres of raw, roadless terrain, deep basalt canyons, stands of ancient ponderosa pine, and sun-baked mesas that haven't changed much since Apache warriors used them to slip away from cavalry patrols in the 19th century. You can walk for 3 days straight out there and never see another tire track or footstep. That kind of isolation usually filters people out. It either grounds you or it eats at you. For a long time, it grounded me. The summer of 2008 was one of the driest on record for Catron County. By late July, the monsoons hadn't come. The scrub oak and alligator juniper were brittle as bone, and the clay beds in the draws had baked into white, cracked puzzle pieces. High fire danger meant we were running double patrols, keeping an eye out for lightning strikes from dry thunderheads that rolled over the Mogollon Rim without dropping a single squall of rain. My primary beat was the northern quadrant, a stretch of country running from the headwaters of the West Fork out toward an area locals call the Iron Creek Mesa. It's rough terrain, cut up by steep limestone cliffs and isolated slot canyons that stay in perpetual shadow even at high noon. My base of operations was a rustic, 2-room log cabin built by the Civilian Conservation Corps back in the 1930s, known as the Diamond Creek Guard Station. It sat in a clearing surrounded by yellow pine, equipped with a propane stove, a solar-powered VHF radio, a iron wood stove, and a hand pump well that drew icy water from a deep subterranean aquifer. My patrol partner that season was Ray Henderson. Ray was 59, 6 months away from retirement, and had lived in southwestern New Mexico his entire life. He was a quiet, weathered man with hands like cured leather and a mind that remembered every cattle boundary, spring, and hunter's camp in the county. Ray didn't care for small talk, which suited me fine, but he knew the forest better than any man I ever met. If a pine branch broke 3 miles away, Ray could usually tell you whether it was a black bear, an elk, or a stray calf that caused it. The first hint that something was off didn't come in the form of a strange footprint or a terrifying scream in the night. It came as a breakdown in the physical routine of the woods. It was a Tuesday afternoon somewhere around the first week of August. The sun was beating down, pushing the mercury past 90 degrees even at 7,000 feet. I had taken the government Dodge Ram as far as the road would allow, which was where the rutted dirt track washed out at the entrance to the Iron Creek drainage, and continued on foot with a 30-pound pack, a crosscut saw, and my issue sidearm. I was heading up to check a remote USGS stream gauge that hadn't sent a telemetry signal in 4 days. As I walked down into the shade of the canyon, the heat dropped off immediately, replaced by that cool, damp basement smell that clings to dark rock walls. The creek was down to a trickle, barely a wet sheen over gray river stones. I noticed the silence about 20 minutes in. Normally a canyon like that is noisy. You've got Steller's jays squawking from the Douglas firs, chipmunks chattering on the talus slopes, and the wind rattling the dry aspen leaves up near the ridgelines. But as I rounded a sharp turn in the canyon wall, a spot where the cliffs rise about 300 feet straight up, the forest sound didn't just fade out. It ceased completely. It was like stepping through a doorway into a vacuum. I stopped in my tracks. I took off my wide-brim hat, wiped the sweat off my forehead with the back of my sleeve, and listened. Nothing. No cicadas, no wind, no distant bird calls. I could hear the slow rhythmic click of my own watch and the dry, raspy sound of my breath moving through my throat. I took a few more steps forward, my heavy boots crunching on the gravel bed. That was when I saw the trees. At the base of the western canyon wall, a grove of young narrow-leaf cottonwoods grew along the dry creek bed. These trees were 30 or 40 feet tall, healthiest things in the canyon, but they weren't growing straight up toward the thin strip of blue sky above. Every single trunk, across a stretch of about 50 yards, had been bent horizontally at a precise 90-degree angle, about 5 feet off the ground. The trunks didn't show fractures. The bark wasn't split, wrinkled, or broken. It looked as though the wood had simply grown flexible like wet clay, bent flush toward the north and then hardened back into solid timber. I walked up to the nearest tree and put my hand on the bend. The wood was cold, unnaturally cold, like smooth steel that had been sitting in an icebox. There were no rope burn marks, no sign of mechanical winches, no fallen boulders that could have pushed them down. Trees don't grow like that. Even if a snow avalanche or a flash flood bends a sapling, the bark tears and the top branches fight their way back toward the sun, creating a curved, swept trunk. These were right angles, clean and sharp as a carpenter's square. I stood there for a long time in that unnatural, muffled quiet, looking at those bent trees. A prickle of heat spread across the back of my neck, that ancient animal instinct that tells you you're being observed by something you can't see. I looked up at the rim of the canyon. The jagged basalt rocks burned white under the afternoon sun, empty and silent. I grabbed my radio off my shoulder strap, clicked the mic, and called base. Gila Base, this is Ranger Callahan on Unit 4, over. The radio didn't produce the usual crackle of static. When I keyed the mic, there was no side tone, no squelch break, just a dull, dead void in the speaker, like the electronics inside were trying to push a signal through deep water. I unclipped the unit, checked the battery indicator, full charge, and tried again on the repeater channel. Same thing. Dead silence. Deciding against pushing further up the drainage alone, I turned around and headed back toward the truck. The moment I crossed back over that invisible line 20 yards down the canyon, the sound of the forest slammed back into my ears with jarring force. A jay. Screaming from a branch overhead, the wind whistling through the pines, the dry rattle of cicadas. I stopped, took 2 paces back toward the bent cottonwoods, and the sound cut off again as cleanly as flipping a switch. When I got back to the Diamond Creek station that evening, Ray was sitting on the porch oiling the chain on his chainsaw. The sun was dropping behind the Mogollon Range, painting the sky in deep shades of burnt orange and bruised purple. Stream gauge working? Ray asked without looking up, his voice gravelly from 40 years of rolled cigarettes. Didn't make it to the gauge, I said, leaning against the porch railing and grabbing a tin mug from the outdoor washstand. Found something weird down in the Iron Creek draw. Ray stopped pulling the rag over the guide bar and looked up at me through his bushy gray eyebrows. What kind of weird? I described the cottonwood trees, the right angles, the cold wood, the total loss of radio signal, and that smothering silence. I expected him to laugh or tell me it was a localized microclimate thing, or maybe some old homesteader's trick he'd seen 30 years ago. Instead, Ray sat quietly for a long moment. He laid the rag down on his knee, pulled a pack of smokes from his shirt pocket, lit one, and stared out toward the darkened tree line. "Iron Creek," he said softly, blowing a thin stream of gray smoke into the cooling air. "That's near the old Miller homestead sector." "Is that down there?" I asked. "I thought the Miller place was further west near the sinks." "The original cabin was in the draw," Ray said. "Back in the 20s. My grandfather told me about it. Old man Miller was a sheep rancher. Brought his wife and 3 kids out from Texas in 1921. Built a house out of hand-hewn logs right near where the canyon narrows. What happened to them?" Ray took another drag, his eyes fixed on the shadows gathering beneath the ponderosas. "They didn't stay long. 18 months, maybe. Miller came into reserve one morning in the middle of winter, leaving his team of horses and his wagon right in the middle of Main Street. He walked into the sheriff's office, handed over his land title, and said he was leaving. Wouldn't take a dime for the place. Just said the ground was unquiet, and that the walls of the canyon were talking back to him wrong." I let out a short, quiet laugh, trying to lighten the atmosphere. "Talking back wrong?" "Echoes," Ray said, perfectly serious. "Miller said if you called out into the canyon at night, the echo wouldn't come back right away. It'd wait, sometimes 10 minutes, sometimes an hour. And when it came back, it wasn't your voice anymore. It was smaller, sharper, like somebody trying to imitate a man using a wooden whistle." Ray spat off the side of the porch and picked his rag back up. Sheriff thought he'd gone mountain mad from the solitude. People didn't talk much about it after that, but the Forest Service never released that draw for grazing. It's been sitting empty for 80 years. We didn't talk much more about Iron Creek that night. We ate a simple dinner of canned chili and biscuits, monitored the late-night radio check-ins with the regional dispatch in Silver City, and went to our cots. But I didn't sleep well. Every time the wind picked up and rattled the tin roof of the guard station, I found myself wide awake, listening for the sound of a voice coming through the dark. 3 days later, on a Saturday, we got the call that shifted everything from an odd woodsman's curiosity into something far more dangerous. Dispatch alerted us at Curso, a solo backpacker, a 31-year-old high school biology teacher from Albuquerque named David Hayes had failed to check in with his wife on Friday night. Hayes was an experienced hiker. He had filed a detailed itinerary with the ranger station in Glenwood before heading out. A 4-day loop starting at Willow Creek, cutting south down the West Fork, and circling back across the high ridge above Iron Creek. He had a spot satellite messenger, a full supply of cold weather gear, and plenty of rations. By mid-morning, a full search and rescue operation was underway. Incident command was set up at the Willow Creek trailhead. We had 3 search teams on the ground, a light helicopter from the New Mexico State Police flying aerial grids, and a regional dog team brought in from Socorro with 2 bloodhounds. Ray and I were assigned to Grid 4, which encompassed the upper rim and the dark slot canyons feeding into the Iron Creek drainage. The weather was holding, but the air felt heavy, charged with static electricity that made the fine hairs on your arms stand up. The sky was a pale, milky blue, washed out by a thin veil of high-altitude dust. We spent 4 hours pushing through thick scrub oak and loose volcanic scree, calling out Hayes' name through a bullhorn at 15-minute intervals. "David. State Park Service Search and Rescue. Can you hear my voice?" Nothing answered except the dry rattle of wind through the canyon walls. Around 2 in the afternoon, we met up with the dog team at the top of a dry saddle overlooking the eastern wall of the Iron Creek draw. The handler was a woman in her late 30s named Sarah, and she looked visibly rattled. Her 2 bloodhounds, big, stubborn dogs that usually had to be practically dragged away from a scent, were sitting flat on their haunches, refusing to move forward down the slope. Their tails were tucked tight between their legs, and they were making a low, wet whining noise in the back of their throats. "They won't take the trail," Sarah said, wiping sweat from her eyes. She was pulling hard on the leashes, but the dogs were digging their paws into the dry pine needles, leaning back with all their weight. They had his scent from a sock his wife provided. "Strong trail leading right up to this ridge." Then they just stopped. "They won't set a paw down into that gulch." "Did they catch a bear scent?" Ray asked, scanning the brush with his binoculars. "Or a mountain lion?" "No," Sarah shook her head firmly. When they smell a cat or a bear, they get aggressive. They bay and strain at the lead. This isn't anger. This is absolute terror. Look at them. One of the dogs began to shiver violently, rolling its eyes back until the whites showed, burying its muzzle beneath Sarah's knee. "All right," I said, looking down into the shadowy mouth of the draw. "Ray, you and Sarah stay on the ridgeline. I'll hike down into the bottom, follow the dry wash half a mile south, and see if I can pick up any shoe prints in the sand." "Jesse," Ray said. His voice dropped an octave, steady and quiet. "Take your hand radio. Keep it on channel 3. If you see anything at all that doesn't look right, you don't investigate it by yourself. You call it in and get back up to this ridge." "Understood," I said. I unclipped my canteen, took a long drink of water, checked the straps on my pack, and began the steep descent down the gravel embankment into the canyon floor. The moment I reached the bottom, that same heavy artificial deadness settled over me. The wind on the ridge vanished. The temperature dropped instantly by 15 degrees. My boots sank into the fine, powdery silt of the dry creek bed. I walked slowly, keeping my eyes locked on the ground, searching for the lug pattern of a vibram boot sole. For the first 300 yards there was nothing, just dry riverstone, fallen branches, and old deer droppings. Then I found the camp. It wasn't a wrecked campsite. It wasn't the scene of an animal attack. In fact, its sheer pristine orderliness was what made my stomach drop into a cold knot. Sitting on a small sandy terrace right in the middle of the wash was a bright orange 2-person tent. It was pitched with meticulous care. Every guy line was staked down into the sand with heavy rocks placed over the pegs for stability. Beside the tent, a small backpacking stove sat on a flat slate rock, a lightweight titanium pot resting on top, half filled with clear, unboiled water. A pair of size 10 leather hiking boots sat side by side outside the tent door, neatly unlaced, tongues pulled forward. A pair of woolen socks was draped over the toe of the left boot. "David?" I called out, my voice sounding flat, swallowed instantly by the sheer walls of rock around me. "David Hayes?" "This is Ranger Callahan." No answer. I approached the tent cautiously, my hand resting on the butt of my holster. I knelt down and unzipped the front mesh door. Inside, a sleeping bag was neatly unrolled over a foam pad. An unlit headlamp, a folded topographic map, a cell phone with no signal, and a leather wallet lay neatly arranged on top of the sleeping bag. Everything was organized with military precision. There was no sign of a struggle. No blood, no torn fabric, no scuff marks in the dirt. It looked as though a man had hiked into this canyon, set up his camp, neatly laid out his worldly possessions, pulled off his boots, and vanished into thin air. I pulled out my radio and clicked the mic. "Ray, this is Jesse. I found his camp." "Repeat, I found the campsite. Sector Iron Creek Draw, about 400 yards south of the saddle." Static filled my ear. Not dead silence this time, but a strange, rhythmic crackle. A cadence that sounded almost like human breathing processed through an old radio transmitter. "Jesse." A voice came through the speaker. I froze. The voice came from the small speaker on my shoulder, but the tone was wrong. It was my voice. It wasn't Ray's gravelly tone, nor was it the crisp voice of dispatch. It was my exact voice, recorded and replayed, using the words I had spoken to Ray 10 minutes earlier up on the ridge. "I'll hike down into the bottom, follow the dry wash half a mile south." The words were strung together slightly wrong. The pauses between words were a fraction of a second too long, the pitch flat and mechanical, like a primitive soundboard. "Ray, do you copy?" I snapped into the mic, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Who is on this channel?" The radio speaker crackled again. "Who is on this channel?" My own voice repeated back to me, perfectly mirroring my exact inflection but carrying a hollow, metallic ring, like someone speaking into a large, empty iron pipe. I unclipped the radio and turned it off completely. The sudden silence that followed was suffocating. I stood up from the tent and looked around the canyon floor. That was when I noticed the footprints. They weren't human footprints, nor were they animal tracks. Surrounding the campsite, pressed deep into the fine river silt, were a series of oval depressions. They were perfectly smooth, about 18 inches long and 4 inches wide, spaced at regular 3-foot intervals. They didn't have toes, heels, or tread patterns. It looked as though someone had taken heavy, smooth wooden stakes with rounded ends and pressed them deep into the earth. The tracks didn't lead to the campsite from the trail. They began abruptly in the open sand 3 feet from the tent door, circled the tent in a tight, deliberate loop, and then proceeded directly toward the eastern cliff wall. I followed the impressions with my eyes. The wall of the canyon here was sheer, polished basalt, rising 200 feet straight up to a rocky outcrop. The tracks didn't stop at the base of the cliff, pressed into the vertical rock face, imprinted straight into the dark. Solid stone as if the basalt had been soft wax, were those same smooth oval depressions, leading straight up the vertical cliff toward the sky. A cold wave of nausea washed over me. I stood there staring at those marks in the rock, my mind desperately trying to construct a rational explanation. Rock climbers using specialized tools, volcanic gas bubbles, water erosion, none of it made sense. The impressions were fresh, cutting clean through the fine layer of dry dust that coated the cliff face. "Jesse," the voice startled me so badly I nearly drew my sidearm. I spun around. Ray was standing at the edge of the wash 30 yards away, breathing heavily, his rifle slung over his shoulder. He took one look at my face, then at the orange tent, then at the ground. "You heard it too," Ray said quietly. It wasn't a question. "My voice," I whispered, my mouth feeling dry as cotton. "On the radio." It was playing back what I said on the ridge. Ray walked over to the tent, looked down at the neatly arranged gear, and then turned his gaze to the cliff wall where the tracks vanished upward into the sky. His weathered face seemed to age 5 years in 5 seconds. The color had drained from his cheeks, leaving him a sallow gray pale. "We're leaving," Ray said, grabbing my arm with a grip like an iron vise. "Right now. We're going back to Incident Command. Ray, we have to log this. We have to search the upper ledge." "We are leaving, Jesse," Ray repeated, his voice dangerously sharp. He looked me dead in the eye, and for the first time in the 5 years I had worked with him, I saw genuine, unadulterated fear in his eyes. "We aren't equipped for this. We report the camp location to the State Police SAR team and we fall back to the station. Now." We hiked back out in complete silence. The dogs were waiting at the ridge, still trembling, heads low to the ground. Sarah looked at us with wide, questioning eyes, but Ray didn't offer a single word of explanation. He simply waved her back toward the trucks. By 5 o'clock that evening, the sky had turned a dark, bruised slate gray. The air was thick with the smell of unburned pine sap and ozone. The long-awaited monsoon storm was finally building. But it wasn't dropping rain, just dry lightning that flickered silently inside towering thunderheads over the mountains to the west. Incident Command was in a state of chaos. Additional search teams had arrived, along with state troopers and 2 news crews from Albuquerque. Ray and I gave our official statement to the search director, a sharp, overworked state police lieutenant named Miller. We told him we had located Hayes's tent and gear in the Iron Creek draw. Ray kept the report strictly factual. Backpacker's tent found intact, occupant missing, no obvious signs of animal predation or physical struggle. He didn't mention the bent cottonwoods. He didn't mention the radio playback. He didn't mention the tracks on the vertical rock wall. I sat on the tailgate of my patrol truck watching Ray talk to the lieutenant. When Ray came back over, I pulled him aside behind the equipment trailer. "Why didn't you tell him?" I asked, my voice low. "About the radio? About the marks on the rock?" Ray took a slow, deep breath, pulling a wooden match from his pocket and snapping it with his thumbnail, though he didn't have a cigarette to light. He watched the tiny yellow flame burn down toward his fingers before blowing it out. "Because," Ray said quietly, "if we tell him that, he puts it in the official federal incident report. Then they send 2 psychologists out here to evaluate our mental fitness. They pull our badges and they send 40 volunteers down into that draw in the dark." He looked at me, his eyes dark and heavy. "Do you want 40 civilian volunteers down in that canyon tonight, Jesse?" I swallowed hard and didn't answer. "The sky is coming down tonight," Ray said, pointing toward the black cloud front rolling over the peaks. "We have high wind warnings, dry lightning, and 0 visibility. Command is suspending the ground search until 06 MUR tomorrow morning. We're ordered to secure the Diamond Creek guard station and hold position until dawn." We drove back to the station in silence. The wind was picking up, howling through the canyons and making the tall ponderosas bend and creak like the masts of old wooden ships. Dry pine needles and small pebbles washed across the dirt road in sweeping gusts. We reached the cabin just as the last daylight died. The forest around us was plunged into absolute suffocating darkness. The solar-powered lights in the cabin flickered weakly. The thick cloud cover had cut off the charging panels early in the afternoon. We lit 2 glass-mantle kerosene lamps and set them on the heavy oak dining table. Ray secured the heavy wooden shutters over the windows, dropping the thick pine crossbars into their iron brackets. He pulled his double-barreled 12-gauge shotgun out of the gun locker, laid it on the table alongside 3 boxes of buckshot, and sat down in the wooden rocking chair near the cold stove. "Ray," I said, sitting across from him in the yellow flickering light of the oil lamp, "you know something about this. You've known something since I brought up those trees 3 days ago." Ray stared at the shotgun on the table. The wind outside slammed against the side of the cabin, making the pine logs groan in their mortar. "I've been in these woods 59 years, Jesse," Ray said, his voice barely louder than a whisper. "My granddaddy was a ranger here back when it was still a territory. There are things in these old mountains that don't belong to any book or map. Things that were here long before the Apache, long before the Spanish." He reached out and turned down the wick of the kerosene lamp slightly, dimming the light until our shadows stretched long and distorted against the log walls. "Old folks used to call them the silt walkers or the tall iron," Ray continued. "They don't hunt like wolves or bears. They don't want meat. They don't have blood in them. They're built out of the dry spaces, the hollow echoes, the heavy air in places where the sun doesn't shine straight. They take things that are quiet and they make them quieter." "What about the voices?" I asked, remembering the terrifyingly accurate sound of my own words coming back through the radio. "It's how they measure," Ray said flatly, "like a bat using sound or a man dropping a stone down a well to see how deep it is. They catch a sound, they shape it, and they play it back to see how close you are. If you answer it, if you talk back to it when it calls, it knows you've acknowledged it. It knows you're listening." A sudden, sharp crack echoed through the forest outside, a sound like a heavy green bough snapping under immense pressure. Both of us went rigid. The wind had suddenly died down. The frantic howling through the pine needles vanished, replaced instantly by that thick, unnatural deadness I had felt in the bottom of the draw. The kerosene lamps began to sputter, the blue flame at the base of the wick stretching upward, thin and bright, before flickering violently. Then came the knock. It wasn't a violent pounding. It was 3 slow, deliberate, heavy thuds against the heavy oak front door of the cabin. Thud, thud, thud. The sound was deep, carrying a low metallic resonance that vibrated through the floorboards under my boots. It sounded as though someone was striking the thick wood with a heavy block of solid iron. Ray stood up smoothly from his chair, picking up the 12-gauge and slipping 2 .00 buck shells into the breeches. He didn't cock the hammers. He stood perfectly still, his eyes locked on the front door. I pulled my service revolver from my holster, my hands shaking so badly I could barely keep my thumb on the hammer. "Jesse," a voice called out from the other side of the heavy oak door. My blood turned to liquid ice. It was Ray's voice. It was undeniably Ray, the exact gravelly, smoke-rasped tone he had used 10 minutes earlier on the porch. "I've been in these woods 59 years, Jesse," the voice said through the door. The cadence was slightly off, the words tumbling out with a flat, lifeless rhythm, as if being read off a tape by someone who didn't understand the language. "My granddaddy was a ranger here. Long before the Apache, long before the Spanish." I took a step toward the door, driven by a bizarre, irrational impulse to open it, to correct the phrasing, to see who was standing there. Ray's hand shot out and slammed against my chest, shoving me back with surprising strength. He shook his head violently, his finger pressed hard against his lips. His eyes were wide with a terror so profound it was sickening to watch. The voice outside stopped. A heavy, agonizing silence fell over the cabin for nearly a minute. Then came the sound on the roof. It wasn't the sound of an animal jumping from a branch. It felt like an immense weight being set down gently onto the tin sheeting above us. The heavy pine rafters groaned under a sudden, massive load. Dust and dried moss rained down from the ceiling logs, falling into our hair and onto the oil lamps on the table. We looked up. The tin roof above the living room began to bow downward. Slowly, inexorably, the corrugated metal, stretching and screeching as if a boulder weighing several Tons was resting directly on top of the ridgepole creek. The iron wood stove pipe that passed through the ceiling began to bend, the black metal buckling at the seam. Then came the sound. It wasn't a growl. It wasn't a roar. It was a sound I can only describe as a massive, hollow friction, like two immense slabs of dry limestone being rubbed together deep underground, accompanied by a high-pitched, metallic hum that vibrated straight through the teeth in my jaw. The air inside the cabin shifted instantly. The atmospheric pressure dropped so fast my ears popped violently, sharp pain shooting through my temples. The smell in the room changed. The warm, familiar odor of kerosene and pine wood vanished, replaced by a cold, metallic stench that smelled like crushed wet slate and old copper coins. The thing on the roof moved. It didn't walk with steps. It seemed to slide across the tin, a heavy dragging motion that made the iron rafters scream under tension. It moved from the center ridgepole toward the back bedroom, the roof plates bowing down 4 inches beneath its path. In the back room, the small glass window was protected by heavy pine shutters barred from the inside. We heard something touch the outer wall. It sounded like dozens of smooth, solid objects, like smooth wooden dowels tapping rapidly against the log siding. Tap, 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 tap. Then came a new voice. This time, it wasn't Ray's voice. It wasn't mine. It was the voice of a man I had never met, but whose tone was instantly recognizable from the audio recordings we had reviewed at Incident Command that morning. It was high, slightly breathless, with the distinct, light cadence of a young teacher. "Sarah," the voice called out from behind the shuttered back window. "They won't take the trail." They had his scent. Strong trail leading right up to this ridge. It was repeating the exact words the dog handler, Sarah, had spoken to us on the saddle hours earlier. Every pause, every gasp for air was reproduced with horrifying fidelity, but rendered in David Hayes's voice. I felt a tear slip down my cheek. My hands were freezing cold, my fingers almost numb on the grip of my gun. "Don't listen," Ray hissed, his voice barely a rasp. "Don't process it. Look at the floor. Look at the wood grain." The voice behind the shutter shifted again. It dropped in pitch, stretching out the syllables until they were barely human. "Jesse," it called out, using my name again. "It's a physical weight, like dry wool pressed hard against your eardrums." It was playing back the thoughts I had held in my own head, the exact, unspoken observations I had made to myself while standing on the rim of the canyon 3 days ago. A violent shudder ran through the entire cabin. The heavy oak door bowed inward, the iron deadbolt screeching as the frame groaned under a slow, immense pressure. The iron brackets holding the window shutters began to bend, the heavy screws tearing slowly out of the solid pine logs with a sickening screech pop. Ray dropped to his knees on the floorboards, holding the shotgun across his lap, his eyes squeezed shut, his lips moving silently in what looked like a desperate, wordless prayer. I fell to my knees beside him. I gripped the edge of the heavy oak table with one hand, my knuckles white, staring at the front door as the wood began to split along the grain. Fine pine splinters showered into the room as the center panel bulged inward toward us. The air grew so cold our breath bloomed in thick white clouds in the dim light of the flickering lamps. The metallic smell of wet stone and copper was so overpowering I gagged, my stomach heaving against nothing. The entity didn't break the door down. It didn't smash the cabin to pieces, though it clearly had the physical strength to crush the structure like an aluminum can. It just pressed. For nearly 2 hours, it held the cabin in that suffocating, crushing embrace. The rafters stayed bowed, the door stayed bent to the point of snapping, and the high-pitched metallic hum vibrated through our bones until my ears were bleeding. A thin, dark trickle of warm blood running down my neck from my right ear canal. Throughout those endless hours, the voice outside never stopped. It cycled through every radio transmission made during the search, every phrase spoken on the trail, every word Ray and I had exchanged over coffee on the porch, stitching them together into long, meaningless streams of human noise that echoed off the surrounding trees, and then, somewhere around 4 in the morning, the pressure simply released. There was no dramatic exit, no receding footsteps, no fading roar. 1 second, the cabin was screaming under thousands of pounds of pressure, the air freezing and thick with the smell of wet stone. The next second, the barometric pressure snapped back with a sudden, painful pop in our lungs. The roof tin sprang back upward with a loud bang like a gunshot. The door settled back into its frame, locked tight. though cracked down the center. The sound of the wind returned, a sudden rushing gust of cool, wet mountain air that rattled the shutters and brought with it the sudden, violent roar of real desert rain pounding down on the tin roof. We stayed on the floor until the gray light of dawn began to seep through the cracks in the wooden shutters. Neither of us spoke. Neither of us moved. When the sun finally cleared the eastern ridge, casting pale yellow light through the pine trees, Ray stood up slowly. His face was gray, his eyes hollowed out, his hands trembling so hard he couldn't unload the shotgun. We unbarred the front door. It took both of us pushing together to force it open. The frame was permanently warped. The oak wood crushed inward along the jamb. We stepped out onto the porch. The morning air was crisp and cold, washed clean by the night's rain. The smell of wet earth and pine needle was thick and rich. Sitting on the wooden porch steps directly in front of the door was David Hayes's titanium backpacking pot. It was completely dry on the inside, resting perfectly level on the wet wood. Surrounding the porch, pressed deep into the mud and through the heavy layer of pine needles, were those same smooth oval depressions. They circled the cabin 3 times, spaced at precise 3-foot intervals, before leading straight toward the solid stone chimney on the north side of the building. From there, the tracks went straight up the stone masonry across the bent tin roof and vanished off the back edge toward the deep, untamed wilderness of the Iron Creek drainage. We didn't wait for the search teams to arrive. We walked to the truck, turned the key, and drove straight down the mountain to the district office in reserve. Ray walked into the district ranger's office, laid his badge, his radio, and his truck keys on the desk, and walked out without saying a single word. He sold his house in Catron County 3 weeks later and moved to an apartment in suburban Phoenix. I haven't heard from him since. I handed in my own resignation 2 days later. The official report on David Hayes was closed 3 months later. Lost hiker, presumed deceased due to exposure and rough terrain. His body was never found. The tent and gear were eventually packed out by a state police crew, who noted in their official log that the campsite appeared unusual, but offered no further details. I live in a small town outside Flagstaff now. I work as an estimator for a commercial building contractor, a dry, boring, completely predictable job that keeps me surrounded by concrete, steel, and city streets. It's been 18 years, but I still don't go into the woods. I don't go camping, I don't go hunting, and I don't visit national parks because every now and then, when a summer thunderstorm rolls over the high desert and the wind drops to absolute zero right before the rain hits, I'll be sitting in my living room and my ears will start to ring. And in that heavy, suffocating silence, if I listen closely enough, I can hear a soft, metallic crackle in the air, like an old radio trying to push a signal through deep water, shaping my own voice, waiting for me to answer. I am 42 years old, and for 14 years I served as a backcountry law enforcement ranger for the National Park Service in the state of Washington. The events I am about to write down took place in late October of the year 2018. I have never shared this narrative in its complete form with the Park Service Administration, nor did I include the true details in the official Incident Management Analysis System report filed at the end of that season. If you consult the public record for the Bogachil Wilderness area for that date, you will find a brief, standardized entry regarding a suspended search and rescue operation for a missing 34-year-old software engineer from Portland, Oregon, named Jonathan Mercer. The file notes that Mr. Mercer's disappearance was attributed to accidental displacement off-trail, followed by acute hypothermia and exposure, with no body recovered. That is the official version. It is clean, concise, and logical. It satisfies the administrative requirements of the Department of the Interior, and it allows the family a grim, familiar sort of closure. But it is not what happened out there in the rainforest, and it is not the reason I quietly submitted my resignation 3 weeks later, turned in my badge and sidearm, and moved to a dry, landlocked town in eastern Oregon where I refused to set foot under a tree canopy after dark. To understand what occurred, you have to understand the geography of the Olympic Peninsula. Most people think of rainforests as tropical, humid places, but the temperate rainforests of the Pacific Northwest are cold, ancient, and immensely dense. The Bogachil Valley, located within the western boundary of Olympic National Park, receives anywhere from 140 to 180 inches of rainfall every single year. The canopy formed by old-growth Sitka spruce, Douglas fir, and western red cedar hangs over 200 feet above the forest floor, blocking out direct sunlight even on the rare clear days. Beneath that high roof, massive hanging curtains of club moss drape from every branch, and the ground is a spongy, rotting carpet of ferns, decaying nurse logs, and damp soil several feet deep. Sound behaves strangely in that environment. The moss acts as a natural dampening material, smothering noise so completely that a person can be standing 50 yards away from a roaring glacial river and hear nothing but the heavy, rhythmic dripping of water from the needles above. By late October of 2018, the seasonal shift had already settled over the peninsula. The summer crowds had long vanished from the coastal beaches and lowland loops. The seasonal park staff had been laid off for the winter, and the district was running on a skeleton crew. The weather pattern had shifted into the predictable, unending autumn drizzle, a cold, needle-fine rain that hovers around 38 degrees Fahrenheit and slowly soaked through even the best technical gear if you spent enough hours exposed to it. I was stationed out of the Wilderness Information Center in Port Angeles, but my primary duty was mobile patrol throughout the western backcountry river drainages, the Hoh, the Queets, and the Bogachil. The call regarding Jonathan Mercer came in on a Tuesday morning around 7:30. I was sitting at my desk in the station house, drinking black coffee and reviewing the weather advisories for the upcoming weekend, when Brenda Miller, our primary dispatch coordinator, knocked on the open door frame. Brenda was a steady middle-aged woman who had worked dispatch for 25 years and had heard every conceivable variation of lost hikers, twisted ankles, and bear sightings. But that morning her expression was unusually focused. She told me that a relative of Jonathan Mercer had called the station 15 minutes prior. Mercer had set off 3 days earlier for a planned 4-day solo trek, entering at the Bogachil trailhead with the intention of hiking up to the high ridge, connecting toward the Solduke drainage, sleeping at designated primitive shelters along the way. He was carrying a commercial satellite messaging device, one of those small orange emergency transponders that allows hikers to send pre-programmed check-in pings to family members. Mercer had been sending his scheduled pings every evening at 7 o'clock like clockwork. On Sunday night, his ping came from Bogachil Shelter Number 2, roughly 12 miles deep into the wilderness. On Monday night, no ping arrived. By Tuesday morning, his brother called us after Mercer failed to meet his agreed-upon satellite check-in deadline by 12 hours. Single missed check-in on a satellite tracker does not automatically trigger a full-scale search and rescue operation. Devices drop signal beneath heavy timber, batteries fail in the cold, and users forget to turn them on. But Mercer was an experienced backpacker. His brother emphasized that Mercer was meticulous, almost obsessive about his wilderness routine. Furthermore, the weather system coming off the Pacific was forecasted to drop nearly 3 inches of rain over the next 48 hours. Bringing a cold front that would push snow levels down to 3,000 feet along the higher ridges. If Mercer was disabled or off trail, he did not have time to wait for a full incident management team to mobilize on Wednesday. I called my supervisor, Senior Ranger Marcus Elliott, who was working out of the ranger station down in Forks. Marcus had spent over 30 years in the park and knew every timber stand and abandoned trail segment between the coast and Mount Olympus. Over the phone, his voice was dry and practical. He agreed that we couldn't wait for a formal team assembly given the incoming storm. He instructed me to take the patrol truck to the Bogachil trailhead, pack 3 days of winter sustainment gear, and hike into Shelter Number 2 to conduct a preliminary point search. Marcus would coordinate with the Clallam County Sheriff's Office to stand up a secondary search team if I didn't make contact with Mercer by mid-afternoon on Wednesday. I packed my standard 70-liter search pack. It contained my cold weather bivouac gear, high-calorie rations, medical kit, trail marking tape, flares, 2 extra flashlights with lithium batteries, my standard-issue Sig Sauer P229 in its chest holster, and a ruggedized Motorola VHF radio tuned to the park's repeater network. By 9 in the morning, I had passed through the small town of Forks and was driving down the long, gravel spur road that winds deep into the timber towards the Bogachil River access. The gravel road was slick with mud and fallen alder leaves. The trees pressed in close on both sides, their lower limbs draped in gray-green lichen that fluttered in the draft of the moving truck. When I reached the trailhead parking lot, I found only one vehicle parked in the dripping gravel, a black Subaru Outback with Oregon plates. I verified the vehicle registration against Mercer's wilderness permit details. It was his car. I took out my official notepad, recorded the license plate, checked the tires, and left a standardized Park Service slip under his windshield wiper, detailing the date and time of our search initiation. I shouldered my heavy pack, adjusted the sternum strap, and stepped past the timber trailhead sign. The moment you step under the ancient canopy of the Bogachil, the world alters. The ambient sound of the gravel road dies instantly, replaced by the soft, endless whisper of falling water. The air was heavy with the smell of wet hemlock bark, rich, decaying soil, and cold river water. The trail at that elevation follows the floor of the river valley, snaking through giant thickets of sword fern that reached as high as my chest. For the first 4 miles, the hike was uneventful. I maintained a steady 3-mile-an-hour pace, keeping an eye on the muddy trail surface for fresh foot impressions. Because of the heavy rainfall, tracks washed out quickly, but I could occasionally discern the faint, crisp tread of a Vibram-soled hiking boot pressed into the firmer clay sections under the cedar roots. The footprints were facing east, deeper into the park, and were accompanied by the distinct indentations of 2 trekking poles. That was Mercer. The depth of the impressions suggested he was carrying a pack weighing around 40 pounds. Moving cleanly and purposefully, around noon, I reached the 4-mile marker at the boundary of the designated wilderness area. The trail here narrows significantly, transitioning from a maintained day-use path into a rugged backcountry trail maintained only by seasonal wilderness crews, clearing fallen timber with crosscut saws. I stopped at the wooden trail register box mounted on a cedar post. I flipped open the rusted metal latch and pulled out the damp log notebook inside. Mercer had signed the register 3 days prior. On Saturday at 8:15 a.m., his handwriting was clean and neat. Jonathan Mercer. Destination, Bogachil Sol Duke Loop, 4 days, solo. Beneath his entry, there were no other names logged for 3 days prior to his arrival. I took out my pen, entered my name, date, and official purpose beneath his line, closed the register box, and checked my watch. It was 12:40. The daylight beneath the heavy overcast was already beginning to take on that dull, grayish twilight quality, typical of late autumn in the Pacific Northwest rainforest. I took a quick sip of water from my canteen, radio dispatched to log my location at the 4-mile marker, and continued up the trail toward shelter number 2, which lay another 8 miles farther east and roughly 1,200 feet higher in elevation. As I pushed deeper into the drainage, the character of the forest began to shift subtly. The river, which had been a constant, reassuring roar to my left, gradually receded down into a steep, timbered gorge, several hundred feet below the trail level. The trail climbed along the side of the ridge, cutting across steep slopes covered in dense thickets of old-growth timber and ancient, rotting, moss-covered blowdowns. It was around 3 in the afternoon when I encountered the first minor anomaly. I was crossing a small, seasonal creek that cut across the trail through a narrow notch in the hillside. The water was running high and brown with mud from the continuous rain. On the far side of the creek crossing, resting on a flat, mossy stone right beside the trail edge, was a small item that immediately caught my eye because of its color. It was a brightly colored plastic whistle, a standard safety whistle of the type often clipped to the sternum strap of modern backpacking packs. I bent down and picked it up. It was bright yellow, clean, and entirely undamaged. The lanyard cord attached to it was dry underneath, having been sheltered slightly by an overhang of ferns, but the outer weave was wet from the recent rain. I turned it over in my hand. It hadn't been dropped weeks ago. It hadn't been trampled into the mud, and there was no silt clinging to the mouthpiece. It looked as though it had been unclipped or torn from a strap very recently. I stood there on the narrow trail, holding the whistle, listening. The only sound was the hollow rattle of the creek beneath the alder logs and the soft cold dripping from the hemlock canopy above. "Jonathan," I called out, using the standard projection technique we use in search operations. Deep, resonant chest voice designed to carry through wet air. "Jonathan Mercer, National Park Ranger. Can you hear me?" I waited. I held my breath and listened for a solid 30 seconds. In the backcountry, sound carries strangely. Sometimes a call will hit a bank of dense fog or heavy timber, and drop completely dead within 100 yards. Other times, an echo will bounce down a drainage and sound like it's coming from behind you. There was no answer. Only the cold rain trickling through the ferns. I pulled out a small Ziploc bag from my chest pack, placed the yellow whistle inside, noted the location on my GPS unit, and slipped it into my pocket. It wasn't uncommon for hikers to lose gear clipped to the outside of their packs, but something about the neatness with which it sat on that stone felt slightly out of place. It hadn't fallen into the mud. It had been placed or dropped precisely on the highest dry stone near the water's edge. I pressed on. The rain increased in intensity around 4 o'clock, turning into a steady freezing downpour that beat rhythmically against the hood of my rain shell. The temperature dropped sharply as the afternoon began to fade into early evening. By 5:30, the light beneath the canopy had faded to a deep, bruised purple. I was using my headlamp now, its LED beam cutting through the misty rain and reflecting off the wet trunks of the giant trees that lined the path. At 6:15, I finally reached the clearing where Bogachil Shelter Number 2 sits. The shelter is an old log structure built back in the 1930s by the Civilian Conservation Corps. It has 3 solid log walls, a cedar shingle roof, a dirt floor, and an open front that faces a small gravel clearing with a stone fire ring. It is designed as an emergency lean-to for backcountry travelers caught in bad weather. I approached the shelter cautiously, directing the beam of my headlamp into the dark interior. "Jonathan?" I called out, keeping my hand near my radio harness. The shelter was empty, but as I stepped under the overhang of the cedar roof out of the falling rain, my light caught clear signs of recent human occupancy. On the wooden bench built into the back wall sat a commercial sleeping pad, a blue foam mat, rolled out and flat. On top of it sat a green 3-season synthetic sleeping bag, unzipped and laid open. Beside the pad was a small camp stove, a titanium cookpot containing half an inch of stagnant rainwater, and a half-eaten energy bar sitting on top of an open, topographical map of the Olympic National Park wilderness. Everything was laid out as if the occupant had simply stepped away for 30 seconds to gather firewood or fetch water from the nearby spring, walked over to the bench and touched the sleeping bag. The fabric was cold, but it was dry. The camp stove was cold to the touch. I looked down at the floorboards and the dirt surface near the shelter opening. There was no sign of a struggle. No overturned gear, no blood, no torn fabric. But what caught my attention immediately was the absence of Mercer's boots and main pack. His internal frame backpack was nowhere in the shelter. His heavy outerwear, his hard-shell jacket and insulated mid-layer were also missing, assuming he had been wearing them when he vanished. Yet his sleeping bag was unzipped, his map was laid open, and his satellite messaging device was sitting right there on the wooden bench, right next to his compass. I picked up the satellite device. The screen was dark. I held down the power button. The screen flickered, showing a low battery indicator, then died completely. The battery was drained. That explained why the Monday night ping had failed to send. The device had simply run out of power. But why would an experienced hiker step out of a dry shelter into a freezing autumn rainstorm, leaving his sleeping system open, his satellite tracker behind, his water filtration system on the bench, and disappear into total darkness without a headlamp or flashlight? I conducted a systematic search of the immediate shelter clearing. I scanned the perimeter with my high-powered searchlight, tracing the line where the cleared dirt met the dense wall of salmonberry and devil's club bushes that hemmed in the site. On the north side of the shelter, pointing away from the established trail and toward the steep, untamed slope that leads down into the upper river gorge, I found a set of clear boot impressions in the soft, dark mud. They were Mercer's tracks. I recognized the distinct heel pattern. He had walked out of the shelter and straight off the cleared site into the unmaintained brush. The tracks were spaced wide, deep at the heels, indicating he had been moving at a brisk walk or a run. But there were no corresponding tracks returning toward the shelter. I followed the tracks for roughly 20 yards into the thick brush. The salmonberry stalks were bent and freshly broken, white wood exposed at the fractures. The trail he had cut led directly down a steep 30-degree slope, choked with slick, moss-covered boulders and dense thickets of slide alder. Standing there at the edge of that steep drop-off, surrounded by absolute pitch-black darkness and the roar of the rain, I pulled out my radio and keyed the mic. Port Angeles Dispatch. This is Ranger Vance on Unit 44. Static hissed from the small speaker on my chest. For 3 or 4 seconds, there was only the cold crackle of atmospheric interference. Then Brenda's voice came through, thin and broken by the heavy timber and high ridges separating us from the Valley Repeater Station. Unit 44. Go ahead, Caleb. Did you reach Shelter 2? Copy, Brenda, I said, speaking slowly and clearly into the mic. I am on site at Bogachiel Shelter 2. I have located the subject's gear. Sleeping bag, pad, stove, and satellite messenger are present inside the shelter. The subject is not present. I have located fresh tracks heading north off trail down into the upper drainage. The satellite device battery is depleted. I am initiating a localized shoreline and perimeter search. But given the darkness and weather conditions, I will need a full SAR team deployed at first light. The radio crackled back. Copy that, Caleb. Stand by for Marcus. A moment later, Marcus Elliott's voice replaced Brenda's. He sounded distant, distorted by the storm, but his tone was sharp. Caleb, what's the weather doing up there right now? It's dropping fast, Marcus, I replied. Rain is heavy. Temperatures sitting right around 37 degrees. Snowline is going to hit the ridge by midnight. If he's down in that gorge without a shelter or a thermal shell, his window is extremely narrow. There was a long pause on the line, filled only by the rhythmic hum of static. Understood, Marcus said finally. We can't get a chopper up in this ceiling tonight. Air National Guard is grounded until at least 0800 tomorrow. I'm assembling a team of 6 ground searchers now. We'll head out from the trailhead at 4 a.m. and should reach your location by 9. Establish a base at the shelter, keep yourself dry, and do not, I repeat, do not, descend into that North Gorge alone tonight in this weather. Do you copy? Copy that, Marcus. I'll maintain position at the shelter, conduct visual scanning from the ridge edge, and wait for the morning team. Good. Check in every 2 hours. Elliot out. I lowered the mic and stood in the dark. The cold had begun to seep through my outer layers now that I had stopped moving. My fingers were getting stiff. I walked back into the dry shelter, unshouldered my heavy pack, and set up my stove to boil water for a hot meal and coffee. The dry shelter felt secure, but the atmosphere inside was deeply unsettling. Mercer's unzipped sleeping bag sat right across from me on the opposite bench, a silent reminder of how quickly a person can slip from comfort into absolute peril in the wilderness. I kindled a small, controlled fire in the stone hearth using dry cedar shavings I had brought in my pack. The warm orange light flickered against the heavy peeled logs of the shelter walls, pushing back the oppressive darkness that pressed against the open front of the cabin. By 8 o'clock, the wind had picked up. It wasn't the steady ocean breeze from the coast. It came in violent, unpredictable gusts that rattled the high branches of the spruce trees overhead and sent cascades of cold water slamming down onto the cedar roof. I sat on my foam pad, my rifle across my knees, sipping instant coffee from a stainless steel mug. I had my field notebook out, detailing the timeline of events and recording every item found in Mercer's pack for the official record. At roughly 8:45, the rain dropped off briefly, shifting from a heavy downpour into that silent, hovering mist that often settles over the rainforest between storm fronts. That was when I heard the sound for the first time. It was not the wind, and it was not a branch snapping under the weight of wet snow at higher elevations. It was an auditory sensation that is difficult to describe precisely, because it seemed to defy the natural acoustic properties of the forest. It sounded like a voice. But it didn't sound like a voice calling out from a distance across open air. It sounded like a voice that was being produced inside a enclosed, hollow space, like someone speaking into an empty wooden barrel or a long PVC pipe. The sound came from the north slope, the exact direction where Mercer's boot tracks led down into the choked salmonberry ravine. Stood up instantly, my body tensing, my thumb flicking off the safety switch of my heavy LED searchlight. Jonathan, I called out, stepping out from under the shelter roof onto the damp gravel clearing. I clicked on the high-powered searchlight. The intense beam sliced through the fog, illuminating the glistening wet leaves of the forest edge 50 yards away. There was no answer. I stood completely still, breathing slowly through my nose, listening. The forest was unnaturally quiet. The sound of the river down in the valley seemed to have faded entirely, replaced by a strange, heavy silence that felt almost physical. as if the air pressure had suddenly spiked. Then, from the darkness down the slope, the sound came again. It was a sequence of short, sharp vocalizations. It didn't sound like a scream for help, nor did it sound like any animal call indigenous to the Olympic Peninsula. It was neither the high-pitched bugle of a Roosevelt elk, nor the raspy yell of a black bear, nor the rhythmic squawk of an owl. It sounded like someone pronouncing 3 distinct disjointed syllables, repeated twice in rapid succession. Ka, le, bibib, ka, le, bibib. I froze. The hair on the back of my neck stood up so fast it felt like an electric shock. The voice was flat. It had no cadence, no inflection, no pitch variation. It sounded entirely mechanical, like a primitive audio tape being played back at slightly reduced speed, and it was pronouncing my name. I raised the beam of the flashlight, aiming it directly down the line of broken salmonberry stalks where Mercer's tracks disappeared. "Who is down there?" I yelled, my voice ringing out harsh and tight in the quiet forest. "This is Ranger Caleb Vance with the National Park Service." "Identify yourself!" No sound came back. I waited for 10 seconds. 20 seconds. My heart was hammering against my ribs. I reached down and rested my right hand on the butt of my Sig Sauer, the leather retaining strap unclipped and ready. As a law enforcement ranger, you are trained for an enormous variety of unpredictable human behaviors in the backcountry. You encounter fugitives hiding out in remote parks, individuals experiencing acute mental health crises, drug operators, and illegal poachers. I told myself logically that Mercer might be severely hypothermic. Late-stage hypothermia causes severe disorientation, cognitive collapse, and paradoxically, a phenomenon known as terminal burrowing, where victims strip off their clothes and crawl into tight, dark spaces under trees or rocks. If Mercer was severely confused and suffering from cerebral edema or hypothermia, his vocalizations might be entirely degraded, and he might have picked up my name when I had radioed dispatch 20 minutes earlier if he was near the shelter. That was the rational explanation. That was what I told myself as I stood on the edge of the dark clearing. I checked my watch. It was 9:10 p.m. Marcus had specifically ordered me not to descend into that gorge alone at night, and standard search protocols strictly forbid a single responder from entering high hazard, unmapped terrain in pitch-black conditions without a belay line or a partner. I pulled my radio from my chest harness and keyed the button. "Port Angeles Dispatch, this is Unit 44. Marcus, come in, nothing, only thick flat static." I adjusted the frequency knob, toggling to the primary repeater, then to the secondary tactical channel. The radio was completely dead, not turned off but receiving no carrier signal from any of the 3 mountaintop repeaters that covered the Bogachiel Valley. The storm, or the dense atmospheric inversions common to the valley during autumn cold fronts, had completely blocked the signal. I was entirely cut off. I returned to the shelter, but I did not sit down. I put my pack back on, adjusting all straps so that I was fully mobile if I needed to move quickly. I pulled my standard issue flashlight into my left hand, kept my right hand hovering over my firearm, and positioned myself near the back log wall of the shelter, facing the open front. The hours between 9 p.m. and midnight passed with excruciating slowness. The rain resumed around 10:30, coming down not as a steady drizzle, but as a torrential downpour accompanied by gusts of wind that whistled through the high cedar boughs above the shelter roof. But beneath the sound of the wind and rain there were other noises, subtle, unnatural sounds that kept my muscles locked in a state of continuous, rigid tension. Every 15 or 20 minutes, I would hear a heavy, wet thump from the perimeter of the clearing. It sounded like something very heavy being dropped from a height into the soft mud. Not the sharp crack of a dead branch falling, but a dull, dense impact, like a large sack of wet soil hitting the ground. Each time the sound occurred, I swept my light across the tree line. The light revealed nothing, only the thick gray trunks of the ancient trees, the swaying ferns, and the relentless veil of falling water. At 11:40, the temperature dropped further. The rain hitting the roof began to slush up, transitioning into heavy, wet flakes of mountain snow. Then, from directly behind the shelter, from the narrow, 2-foot gap between the back, log wall of the cabin and the steep earth bank, carved into the hillside, I heard a sound that made my chest tighten so hard I couldn't draw a full breath. It was the sound of something dragging itself along the gravel ground. It was slow, rhythmic, and heavy. Scritch, slide, scritch, slide. It moved along the entire rear length of the log building, barely 6 inches from where my back was resting against the interior wall. I spun around, bringing my flashlight beam up to shine on the heavy timber walls. The logs were 9 inches thick, solid old-growth Douglas fir, notched and fitted together by hand 80 years ago. They were sound, but between the 4th and 5th log course, near the corner, there was a small gap where the old lime mortar chinking had cracked and fallen away over decades of damp decay. I stepped closer to the gap. My light focused on the narrow horizontal slit. I stopped breathing. Through the 2-inch gap in the wall, illuminated by the cold white light of my flashlight, something was moving. It was not a bear. It was not a mountain lion. What passed by that gap was a surface, a dark, wet, glistening surface covered in a dense, chaotic mat of what looked like wet, gray-green lichen and compressed, decaying spruce needles. But beneath that organic coat, the structure was shifting, working with an unnatural, fluid geometry, like a mass of thick, ropey muscle sliding under a wet leather hide. And as it passed the gap, a smell flooded into the shelter through the broken chinking. It was not the smell of a dead animal, nor was it the sharp, musky scent of a predator. It smelled like stagnant swamp water, damp cellar soil, and something distinctly iron-rich, like stale blood mixed with crushed pine resin. I stood frozen, my finger pressed tight against the trigger guard of my pistol. The movement outside the wall stopped. For 5 long seconds, there was absolute stillness. The only sound was the cold, slushy rain falling on the cedar shingles above my head. Then, right at the level of the gap in the log wall, 3 inches from my face, a voice spoke. It did not use my name this time. It spoke in a voice that was instantly, horrifyingly recognizable to me. It was the voice of Senior Ranger Marcus Elliott. The pitch, the drawl, the slight rasp in his voice from 40 years of smoking. It was an exact replica of my supervisor's voice. But the words were wrong. They were spoken without pauses, without cadence strung together like sentences cut out of a recording and spliced back together, without rhythm. Caleb, come out to the truck. We need to talk about the search protocol. Caleb, come out to the truck. The voice came directly from that dark gap in the wood. My blood ran completely cold. A profound, instinctual terror, something ancient and primal that overrides all professional training and logic, flooded through my nervous system. My hand was shaking so violently that the flashlight beam trembled against the log wall. Marcus is at the station house, I whispered under my breath, my voice barely audible over the patter of the slush. Marcus is down in Forks. The thing outside the wall did not react to my voice. It repeated the phrase again, identical in tone, identical in every acoustic flaw, like a broken phonograph needle jumping across a groove. Caleb, come out to the truck. We need to talk. I didn't scream. I didn't fire my weapon. I pulled back slowly, step by step, keeping my light fixed on the gap until my heel struck the front bench of the shelter. I backed into the center of the structure, near the low embers of the small fire in the stone ring. The dragging sound resumed. Scritch, slide. It moved away from the rear wall, circling around the eastern corner of the shelter toward the open front. I raised my pistol with both hands, aiming the sight directly at the empty, dark opening where the open front of the shelter met the blackness of the forest clearing. Stay back, I shouted, my voice cracking slightly. Stay back or I will discharge my firearm. The dragging sound stopped right at the edge of the gravel clearing, just out of the line of sight offered by the shelter's side wall. Silence descended again, heavy, suffocating, and absolute. I stood there in the center of the shelter for 3 straight hours without moving my feet. I did not sit down. I did not blink if I could avoid it. I kept my flashlight beam pinned on the front opening, my fingers numb against the steel frame of my sidearm, waiting for whatever was standing in the dark outside to step into the light. It never did. Instead, as the hours dragged toward 3 in the morning, The air temperature inside the shelter dropped precipitously. My breath billowed out in thick white clouds. The slush on the roof turned to heavy, silent snow. Outside in the dark, just beyond the range of my light, the entity began to move around the perimeter of the clearing in wide, slow circles. As it moved, it produced a sequence of sounds that seemed designed to test different acoustic frequencies. It made the sound of a heavy branch snapping. Then it made the sound of a zipper being pulled down on a nylon tent. Then it made the sound of Mercer's satellite beacon clicking. Then it produced the sound of a woman crying softly. A sound that drifted through the falling snow with an eerie, weightless quality. It was picking through a mental catalog of sounds, testing them against the silence of the woods. I did not move. I knew instinctively, with a terrifying absolute clarity, that if I stepped out of that shelter, if I allowed myself to follow any of those sounds down into the dark, I would end up exactly like Jonathan Mercer. My boots would be left in the mud, my radio would sit uselessly on a bench, and my voice would be added to whatever collection of mimicry was circulating through the bogachial drainage. At 5:30 in the morning, a faint pale gray light began to bleed into the high forest canopy above. The transition from night to dawn in the rainforest is slow and subtle. The deep blackness gradually dissolves into a misty monochromatic slate gray. The giant trunks of the spruce trees materialize out of the gloom like giant stone pillars. As the light grew, the sounds outside the clearing ceased completely. There was no final retreat, no heavy footsteps running into the distance. The presence simply vanished, dissolving into the wet woods as the shadows receded. By 6:45, the daylight was sufficient to see across the entire clearing. I stepped out from under the shelter roof, my joints stiff and aching from hours of immobility, my rifle still held at the ready. The fresh layer of wet snow on the ground was roughly 2 inches deep. It covered the gravel clearing, the stone fire ring, and the surrounding fern beds. I walked slowly around to the back of the shelter, my boots crunching softly in the fresh snow. The ground behind the cabin, where I had heard the dragging sound against the log wall, was completely churned up. The 2-inch layer of fresh snow had been swept aside down to the raw earth in a wide, 3-foot swathe that wound around the rear of the cabin. But there were no boot prints in that swathe. There were no animal tracks. It looked as though a massive, heavy cylinder, like a waterlogged cedar trunk 40 feet long, had been dragged through the mud and snow, leaving behind a smooth, rutted trench coated with a thick, yellowish gel that was slowly being washed away by the melting snow. Beside the trench, lying in the mud right beneath the gap in the log wall, was an object. I bent down and looked at it without touching it. It was a piece of clothing, a torn saturated collar from a gray wool base layer shirt. The tag inside the neck was still legible through the mud. Size medium. J. Mercer. I did not stay at shelter number 2. I packed my operational gear in less than 3 minutes. I left Mercer's sleeping bag, stove, and satellite device exactly where they lay, preserving the site for the secondary search team. I turned back down the trail toward the western trailhead, moving at a fast, almost reckless pace, my hand never straying far from my firearm holster. As I descended the trail, the snow turned back into a freezing, continuous rain. The forest around me was quiet, the normal, mechanical sounds of the rainforest, water dripping from leaves, the distant rush of the river down in the canyon, the soft wind through the upper canopy. I met Marcus Elliott and the 6-man search team roughly 4 miles from the trailhead at 8:30 in the morning. They were hiking up in a single file, wearing bright orange high-visibility rain shells carrying heavy search packs and ropes. Marcus was at the front of the line, his face red from the steep climb, carrying a radio handset in his gloved hand. When he saw me coming down the trail, he stopped, gesturing for the rest of the team to hold up. "Caleb," he called out as I approached. "What are you doing coming down?" "Did you find him?" I stopped 10 feet from Marcus. I looked at his face, his real face wet with rain, his heavy gray mustache, his sharp practical eyes looking at me with genuine concern and confusion. I couldn't speak for a long moment. My throat was dry and my chest felt light and hollow from exhaustion and lingering panic. "No," I said, my voice hoarse. "I didn't find him." "What happened to your radio?" Marcus asked, stepping closer. "We tried hitting you on the tactical channel every half hour since midnight." The repeater went down on the ridge around 3 a.m. The signal was blocked, I said. I looked past Marcus at the 6 other searchers. Local volunteers, mountain rescue staff, guys I had known and worked with for years. They looked normal. The world felt normal again, grounded in the mundane reality of gear straps, Gore-Tex fabric, and muddy trails. Marcus, I said, dropping my voice so the rest of the crew couldn't hear. Mercer's gear is up at Shelter 2. He went off trail down into the North Gorge. His tracks go straight down into the salmonberry brush. His pack is gone, but his sleeping system and his beacon were left behind. Marcus studied my face carefully. He had been doing search and rescue in the Pacific Northwest for 30 years. He knew how people looked when they had spent a night in the deep woods dealing with hypothermia or injury. He saw something in my eyes that made him halt his standard line of questioning. "Are you all right, Vance?" he asked quietly. "I'm fine," I lied. "I'm going down to the station house to file the preliminary log and get the secondary comms unit online." Marcus looked at me for 3 long seconds. He didn't push it. He nodded slowly. "All right," he said. "Head down to the truck. Get some dry clothes on. We'll take the team up to Shelter 2. Establish a grid along that north slope and call in the dog teams if the snow clears up." "Marcus," I said, holding his arm as he turned to move. "Past me, yeah? Don't let anyone go down into that North Gorge alone," I said, looking him dead in the eye. "Not even during the day. Keep everyone in pairs, radio contact every 15 minutes, visual contact at all times." Marcus looked at my hand on his sleeve, then back up at my face. He saw the cold, unyielding seriousness in my expression. "Copy that, Caleb," he said quietly. "Pairs only." I walked the remaining 4 miles down to the trailhead alone. When I reached the parking lot, the black Subaru Outback belonging to Jonathan Mercer was still there, sitting under the dripping alders covered in a thin layer of fallen leaves. The slip I had placed under his windshield wiper was soaked through, the ink smeared by the continuous rain. I got into my patrol truck, started the engine, turned the heater on full blast, and sat there in the idling vehicle for 20 minutes, staring at the tree line through the fogged-up windshield. The search for Jonathan Mercer continued for 6 days. They brought in dog teams from King County, helicopter support from Naval Air Station Whidbey Island, and over 40 ground searchers. They combed the north slope of the Bogachiel drainage down to the riverbank, set up sweep lines through every thicket of Devil's Club, and flew low-altitude infrared sweeps over the entire ridge system. They found nothing. No body. No backpack, no boots, no further clothing fragments. The search dogs behaved strangely on the 3rd day when brought to the north slope below Shelter 2. According to one of the handlers from Seattle, 2 of the air-sent dogs refused to descend into the ravine, sitting down in the mud and whining until they were taken back to the main trail. The handler assumed there was a dead elk or a cougar carcass down in the brush that was unsettling the animals. I took 3 days of personal leave immediately following the incident. I stayed in my small rental house in Port Angeles, leaving all the lights on, sleeping with a loaded 12-gauge shotgun resting beside my bed. Every time the wind blew through the Douglas firs in my backyard, every time a branch scraped against the window pane, I found myself sitting bolt upright in the dark, listening for the flat, mechanical echo of a voice that didn't belong to a human being. On November 14th, 2 weeks after the search for Mercer was officially suspended, I walked into Marcus Elliott's office at the district headquarters. I placed my official incident report on his desk. It was written entirely in clean, standardized law enforcement prose. It detailed times, distances, weather conditions, track locations, and gear descriptions. It contained no mention of the voices, no mention of the sound behind the log wall, and no mention of the organic trench found in the snow, behind Shelter 2. I listed the probable cause of disappearance as severe disorientation leading to accidental displacement and environmental exposure. Marcus looked down at the report, then looked up at me. He didn't open the file. "You're sure about this report, Caleb?" he asked softly. "I am," I said. I reached into my pocket, took out my brass Park Service Ranger badge, my official ID card, and the keys to my patrol vehicle, and placed them on top of the paper folder. Marcus looked at the badge for a long moment. He didn't look surprised. "You've been a good ranger, Vance," he said, his voice quiet. 14 years is a long time in the backcountry. "It's long enough," I said. He didn't ask me why I was resigning. He didn't push for an explanation. He simply stood up, offered me his hand and shook it with a firm, silent grip. As I turned to leave his office, he spoke one last time, "Caleb." I stopped at the doorway, my hand on the brass handle, without turning around. "The old-timers who logged these valleys back in the 20s, Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They had names for certain drainages up in the high country. They didn't go into the upper Bogachiel or the Queets headwaters after the autumn rain started. They said some places in the forest don't belong to the state, and they don't belong to the Park Service either. They said there are things out here that have been sitting under this canopy since before the first road was cut, learning how to sound like us." I didn't answer him. I opened the door, stepped out into the hallway, and walked out of the building into the cold Pacific Northwest afternoon. I moved to Eastern Oregon 2 weeks later. I live now in a small town situated on the edge of the high desert, where the landscape is open, dry and flat for miles in every direction. There are no ancient spruce forests here. There are no curtains of hanging moss, no deep river gorges choked with salmonberry, and no vast untamed canopies blocking out the sky. I work as a code enforcement inspector for the county government. It is routine, predictable, mundane work. I spend my days inspecting building sites, checking property lines, and writing reports in a dry, sunlit office. I have adjusted to my new life. I have built a quiet, functional existence. But the experience of that night at Bogachiel Shelter 2 has never left me. It lives in the back of my mind, a permanent cold weight that sits behind every thought. Sometimes, during the late autumn months when a rare weather system moves inland from the coast and brings rain to the desert, I will wake up in the middle of the night. I will lie there in the dark, listening to the soft, rhythmic patter of water against my bedroom window pane. And as I lie there, waiting for the sun to rise over the dry rim rock, I find myself thinking about the yellow safety whistle I found resting on that dry stone by the creek. I think about how clean it was, how neatly it sat on the moss, and how it had been placed there, not dropped by accident, but left like bait on a trap, waiting for someone to stop, bend down, and listen for a voice calling out from the trees. I was working as a full-time backcountry law enforcement park ranger for the National Park Service in the state of Washington. I have kept what happened to me during those 3 days in late September, buried for nearly a decade, tucked away behind official incident logs, polite resignations, and the quiet, sterile language of federal paperwork. But the mind does not allow you to file away certain memories under administrative headers. It keeps them raw. It keeps them humming in the back of your skull, loud enough to wake you at 3 a.m. when the wind shifts against your bedroom window. I am writing this down now because I need to lay it out on paper exactly as it occurred, stripped of official protocol and government euphemism, before the details lose their sharp, terrifying edges and leave me doubting my own sanity. To understand what happened, you have to understand the land itself. The Olympic Peninsula is not like the rest of the American West. It is not the dry, open granite of the Sierras or the sharp, barren peaks of the Rockies. It is a dense, suffocatingly wet, old-growth temperate rainforest that wraps around the jagged spine of the Olympic Mountains. Places like the Hoh, the Quinault, and the Bogachiel receive upwards of 140 inches of rainfall every year. The canopy overhead, composed of Sitka spruce, Douglas fir, and western red cedar, is so thick that in some sections of the deep backcountry, direct sunlight never touches the forest floor from October to May. Moss hangs from every branch in heavy, damp green curtains. Ferns grow as high as a man's chest. The ground is a soft, deep sponge of decaying hemlock duff, fallen logs, and subterranean root systems that can cave in under your boots without warning. It is a place of staggering beauty, but it is also a place where a human being can step 20 paces off an established trail and disappear completely from the known world. In September of 2016, I was stationed out of the Wilderness Information Center in Port Angeles, though my actual patrol zone covered the remote, high-country borderlands between the Solduke River Valley and the upper drainage of the Bogachiel Wilderness. It was seasonal transition work. The summer crowds of tourists in running shoes were thinning out, replaced by early-season hunters. Along the forest boundaries in hard scrabble, solo backpackers trying to squeeze in one last high divide loop before the winter, rains lock down the mountain, passes. On the morning of Tuesday, September 20th, I was sitting in the duty office in Port Angeles. finishing a mug of bitter black coffee and reviewing trail maintenance reports when Marcus Reyes walked in. Marcus was 54 years old, a 20-year veteran of the park, and a man who possessed the kind of quiet, weathered pragmatic calm that only decades in the woods can build. He didn't speak unless he had something to say, and he rarely smiled unless he was looking at a topo map that showed an area he hadn't walked yet. He dropped a yellow manila folder onto my desk and leaned against the doorframe, his rain jacket dripping onto the linoleum. "Dispatch got a call from a woman in Portland late last night," Marcus said, his voice low and dry. "Name is Sarah Miller. Her brother, Julian Miller, was supposed to check in with her on Sunday evening. He drove up from Oregon last Wednesday, parked his truck at the Bogachil trailhead, and planned to do a 5-day solo loop up through the river valley, crossing over the Seven Lakes Basin cutoff, and coming out at Solduc." I pulled the folder toward me and opened it. Inside was a photocopy of a driver's license showing a young man with light brown hair, glasses, and a thin, serious mouth. Julian Miller, 31 years old. Profession, hydrogeologist. Experience level, listed by his sister as an intermediate navigator with off-trail experience. "Vehicle check?" I asked, looking up at Marcus. "A county deputy ran his plate at the Bogachil trailhead at 6 this morning," Marcus replied. His Ford Ranger is still sitting in the turnout, windshield covered in pine needles. No sign of him at the registration box. He didn't sign the log on the way in, which means he either skipped the box or took an unmaintained feeder trail. "Weather's turning," I said, glancing out the window at the low, gray belly of clouds hanging over the Strait of Juan de Fuca. "Yeah," Marcus said, rubbing the back of his neck. "There's a front coming off the Pacific tonight. Temperatures in the high country are going to drop into the mid-30s, and we're looking at 2 to 3 inches of rain over the next 48 hours. If he's injured or off route up near the divide, he's going to be wet and hypothermic by tomorrow morning." "Are we mounting a full SAR?" "Not yet," Marcus said. "Regional office wants a containment sweep first. You and I pack 3 days of gear, drive out to the Bogachil access, and walk the lower valley up to the Boulder Creek Junction. If we don't find him at the shelter or along the main corridor, SAR brings in the dogs and the air support on Thursday morning, once the fog clears. Grab your heavy pack, Tom. We leave in 20 minutes. We took the Park Service Suburban West down U.S. Route 101, skirting the southern shoreline of Lake Crescent. The water was flat and black, reflecting the dark, timbered slopes of Mount Storm King. The rain began as a faint icy drizzle near Fairholme, coating the windshield in a greasy film that the wipers barely managed to smear away. We turned off the highway onto the narrow, rutted gravel of the Forest Service roads, winding deep into the cutover timber of the National Forest before crossing back over the boundary into the National Park. By 11 o'clock that morning, Marcus and I had hauled our 50-pound packs out of the back of the truck at the Bogachil trailhead. The air was thick with the heavy, rich scent of damp earth, river silt, and decaying cedar. The river was running high and gray, churned up by recent mountain runoff, its dull roar echoing through the trees like distant highway traffic. We checked our radios, Motorola APX units linked to the park's VHF repeater network, pulled our brimmed rain hats down tight, and set off into the forest. For the first 4 miles, the trail followed the gentle, winding contours of the river floor. The world was entirely green and brown. Giant Sitka spruces, 8 feet thick at the buttress, towered over a thick understory of sword fern and salmonberry bushes. The silence of an old-growth forest is not absolute. It is a heavy, layered thing. You hear the rhythmic drip of water falling from 60 feet above, the soft, muffled crunch of your own boots sinking into the wet needlecast, and the distant, hollow drum of a pileated woodpecker striking a dead snag. Marcus walked in front, his long, steady stride eating up the distance without effort. We stopped every half-mile to blow our emergency whistles, 3 short, sharp blasts that cut through the damp air, and then stood still for 2 minutes, listening intently for any response. Nothing came back except the steady drip of rain and the rush of the river. Around 2 in the afternoon, we reached the junction where the main Bogachil River Trail splits toward the steep, unmaintained switchbacks that climbed toward the high country of the Solduc Divide. There was a crude, 3-sided log shelter built by the Civilian Conservation Corps back in the 1930s, sitting in a small clearing near the confluence of a mountain stream. We dropped our packs beneath the overhang of the shelter's cedar shingle roof. The air inside smelled of old campfires, damp stone, and mice. "Anything?" I asked, wiping cold moisture from my forehead with the back of my glove. Marcus didn't answer immediately. He was crouched by the fire ring, examining the ash with a slender cedar stick. He reached down and picked up a tiny burnt scrap of aluminum foil, the corner of a freeze-dried meal pouch. "Someone was here," Marcus said, standing up and brushing his knees. "Maybe 2 days ago. Ash is cold, but it's dry underneath this top layer. He stayed the night here." "Did he leave a log entry?" I stepped over to the small wooden box mounted to the corner post of the shelter, which held a weather-resistant notebook where hikers signed in. I opened the plastic cover and flipped through the pages. The last official entry was dated 4 days prior, a party of 3 northbound hikers. But on the reverse side of the last page, written in faint, hasty pencil, was a single line: Sept 17, J. Miller, taking the North Fork draw toward the ridge. Topo map shows a bench at 3,400 left. Sounds like someone is calling from the upper drainage. Need to check the survey mark. I stared at the pencil marks. The handwriting was neat, precise, the script of a surveyor or engineer, but the phrasing was strange. "Marcus," I called out, handing him the notebook. "Look at this." Marcus took the book, squinting through the dim light of the shelter. His thick eyebrows pulled together as he read the lines. "North Fork draw?" Marcus muttered. "There's no maintained route up the North Fork draw. That's a box canyon. It dead ends into a sheer vertical cirque right below Bogachiel Peak. It's all blow-down Devil's Club and loose shale. Why the hell would he go up there? And what does he mean by sounds like someone is calling?" I asked. Marcus shook his head, closing the notebook and tucking it back into the waterproof box. "Hikers get turned around. Sound bounces off these granite walls in weird ways. A waterfall 2 miles away can sound like a human voice if the wind catches it right through a narrow chute. But if he went up into that draw, he's in trouble. If he slipped on that wet shale, he could be sitting at the bottom of a ravine with a broken femur." We checked the time. It was 20 minutes past 2. Darkness would fall completely by 6:30 under this cloud cover. "We leave the heavy gear here," Marcus decided, unclipping his main pack. "We take our day packs, emergency bivy sacks, ropes, and medical kits. We head up the draw, push as far as the lower bench, and if we don't find him by 5, we turn back. Spend the night in this shelter and call in the full SR team at first light." We unhooked our heavy loads, secured our survival essentials into light 20-liter assault packs, and stepped off the main trail into the untamed bush. Leaving a maintained trail in the Olympic backcountry is like stepping off the edge of a map. Within 30 yards, the familiar markers of civilization disappear. You are suddenly forced to fight for every yard of progress. We picked our way along the edge of the North Fork stream, scrambling over rotting fallen logs that were slick as ice, forcing our way through thickets of Devil's Club whose needle-like thorns bit through our canvas pants. The draw narrowed rapidly as we climbed. On either side, the forested slopes rose up at brutal angles choked with hemlock and Douglas fir. The ambient light began to change. The gray sky above was squeezed out by the overhang of the canyon walls, casting everything in a strange monochromatic twilight. By 4 in the afternoon, we had reached an altitude of roughly 2,800 feet. The sound of the main river had faded completely, replaced by the thin, white hiss of the mountain stream tumbling over mossy boulders far below us. The air had grown noticeably colder. Our breath billowed out in faint clouds of white. "Miss, that was when I found the first object," was stepping over a decaying cedar trunk. Tree that must have been 6 feet in diameter when it fell 50 years ago, when something bright caught my eye tucked into a hollow of the bark. It was a plastic water bottle, a Nalgene dark blue filled to the brim with clear water. It hadn't been dropped or thrown down in a fall. It was standing perfectly upright inside a small, dry notch in the rotting wood, as if someone had placed it there with deliberate, painstaking care. "Marcus," I called out, reaching down to pick it up. Marcus paused 20 feet ahead of me, turning around on the steep slope. He looked at the bottle in my hand. "Is it his?" he asked. I unscrewed the cap. Marked on the lid in white paint marker were the initials. JM. "It's his," I said. "Why would he leave his water bottle in a log hollow? He's walking up a mountain stream. He doesn't need to stash water." Marcus walked back toward me, his boots crunching in the gravel. He took the bottle, examined it, and then looked around us. The forest was dead silent. The rain had slowed to a fine, barely perceptible mist that hung suspended in the motionless air. Maybe he was shedding weight, Marcus offered, though his tone lacked conviction. Or maybe he was marking his path. You mark a path with blaze tape or cairns, I said. You don't leave your primary water source behind. We pushed on, climbing higher into the draw. The terrain became increasingly chaotic. Huge granite boulders sloughed off the upper ridges during some ancient rockfall, lay scattered through the trees like forgotten headstones. The moss on these boulders was thick and undisturbed, except in one spot about 100 yards higher up the slope. Marcus spotted it first. A patch of bright green moss had been scraped fresh off the top of a chest-high boulder, exposing the dark, wet rock beneath. Beside the boulder, sitting neatly on a flat stone, was a small black folding pocket knife. It was open. The stainless steel blade was extended, pointing precisely toward the upper end of the draw. Marcus reached out, but he didn't pick it up immediately. He stood crouching over the stone, his face hard, his gray eyes scanning the dense wall of ferns ahead of us. This isn't right, Marcus said quietly. What do you mean? Look at the knife, Tom. Look at how it's placed. The knife wasn't dropped. It hadn't fallen out of a pocket during a scramble. It was resting on its spine, the blade locked out, pointing straight up into the dark timber toward the high cirque. Julian, Marcus suddenly shouted, his voice cracking out across the quiet draw. National Park Rangers. Julian Miller, can you hear us? We waited. In the mountains, a shout usually travels. It echoes, bounces, or at least dies away gradually. But here, in this narrow slot between the mountain walls, Marcus's voice seemed to fall flat, absorbed almost instantly by the heavy moss and dense canopy. There was no echo. There was only the flat, dull silence that followed. Then, from somewhere far up the slope, perhaps 300 yards above us in the thick fog that had begun to spill over the upper ridge, we heard a sound. It was a voice. It was faint, muffled by the distance and the trees, but it was unmistakably human. It sounded like a long, drawn-out call, the words unintelligible, pitched in a high-strained register. Julian, I yelled, stepping forward, taking my whistle and blowing 3 sharp, deafening blasts. We stood frozen, listening. A few seconds passed. Then the voice came again. This time it was slightly clearer, though still strangely flat, as if spoken through a long pipe. Over here. Marcus looked at me, his eyes wide. He's up on the bench. Did that sound right to you? I asked, a sudden cold prickle of unease running down the back of my neck. What do you mean? The cadence, I said, trying to make sense of the strange sensation settling in my chest. It didn't sound like someone shouting for help. It sounded spaced out, like he was reading off a card. Marcus pulled his radio off his shoulder strap and keyed the mic. Dispatch, this is Unit 42. We have auditory contact with the missing party in the North Fork Draw, approximately 2,900 feet elevation. Proceeding toward his location, over. The radio burst into loud, harsh static. A series of metallic pops and warbles spewed from the small speaker, followed by a voice that sounded like Sarah from the Port Angeles office, but chopped into illegible fragments by electromagnetic interference. Unit 42, repeat, signal, heavy, static, do not, static. Dispatch, you are breaking up, Marcus said into the mic. We are moving up to secure the subject. He clipped the radio back to his chest. Let's go. We've got less than an hour of daylight. We moved faster now, scrambling up the steepening slope, using the trunks of young hemlocks to pull ourselves up through the loose dirt and slick rock. The fog was descending rapidly, creeping down from the upper cirque like a thick white sheet being pulled over the forest. Within 15 minutes, visibility had dropped to less than 50 feet. The towering spruces became ghostly gray silhouettes looming out of the pale gloom. We reached the bench at 4:45. The bench was a relatively flat shelf of land, 50 yards wide, wedged between the sheer granite wall of the ridge and the steep drop-off of the draw. It was choked with dense thickets of blueberry bushes and stunted alpine fir. Julian, I called out, my voice swallowed by the thick fog. We're in the clearing. Stay where you are. Silence. We walked cautiously across the bench, our boots sinking into saturated sphagnum moss that squelched with every step. Near the center of the bench, we found his camp. It was pitched on a flat patch of ground between two massive fir trees. A high-end two-person backpacking tent, orange and gray. The rainfly was drawn tight, staked down perfectly into the ground with lightweight aluminum pegs. "Julian?" Marcus called out, approaching the tent from the side, his hand resting instinctively on his belt. There was no response. Marcus used the tip of his boot to gently tap the side of the tent. It was firm. He knelt down, unzipped the outer vestibule, and pulled back the inner mesh door. He unclipped his flashlight and shone the beam inside. I leaned over his shoulder to look. The tent was entirely dry. Inside, a sleeping bag was neatly unrolled atop a foam pad. Beside the bag sat Julian Miller's backpack, a 60-liter framed pack fully organized. His water filter, his stove, his spare clothing, and his food bag were all neatly arranged inside or beside the pack. On top of the sleeping bag lay a small, black spiral notebook open to a blank page near the back. Resting on the open notebook was a pair of wire-rimmed eyeglasses. Marcus reached in and picked up the glasses. They were clean. No smudges, no rain spots. "He left his glasses," Marcus said, his voice dropping an octave. "His pack is here. His food is here. His stove is here. A man doesn't walk away from his camp in a freezing rainforest without his jacket, his boots, or his sight." I looked down at the floor of the tent. Standing in the corner, side by side, were Julian's hiking boots. They were heavy leather Vasque boots laced up tight, sitting upright as if his feet were still inside them. A sudden wave of cold air seemed to wash through the clearing. Though the fog around us remained dead still, the dampness seemed to creep straight through my waterproof layers, settling deep into my bones. "Marcus," I whispered, looking around at the wall of fog surrounding our small illuminated circle. "Where is he?" Marcus didn't answer. He reached into the tent and picked up the spiral notebook. He flipped back a few pages, holding it under the beam of his flashlight. I moved closer to read over his shoulder. The first few entries were mundane, notes on rock formations, stream flow rates, elevation checks, but the entry dated 2 days prior, Sunday, September 18th, was different. 40 a.m. Reached the upper bench. The map is wrong. The contour lines indicate a steep face here, but there is an open corridor leading northeast that doesn't show on the 7.5-minute quad. Weather clear. 2:15 p.m. Heard someone calling my name from the tree line. Thought it was another hiker. Called back, but they repeated my name using the exact same tone every time. "Julian Edward Miller. No one here knows my middle name. I haven't seen another person since Friday. 6:40 p.m. Fog came in fast. The sound is closer now. It isn't coming from outside the tent. It's coming from beneath the ground under my vestibule. It sounds like my sister's voice. She's telling me to take off my boots so I don't tracking mud into the hallway." The handwriting on the last page had deteriorated significantly. The lines were jagged, pressed so hard into the paper that the graphite had torn through the page in several places. It's not a voice. It's a shape that uses sound. It takes the noise you make and gives it back to you until you forget which side of the wall you're standing on. I am leaving my glasses so I don't have to see it when it calls. Marcus closed the book with a sharp snap. His face was pale in the harsh LED light of his flashlight. "We're turning back," Marcus said flatly. His voice had lost its steady administrative calm. It was tight, trimmed down to pure survival instinct. We pack his notebook and his ID. We go back to the CCC shelter, we set up for the night, and we call regional headquarters on the heavy radio at first light. "Marcus, listen," I said, raising my hand. He froze. The forest had gone completely, utterly quiet. In the Pacific Northwest, even in the deepest woods, there is always a background hum of motion, the drip of condensation, the rustle of voles under the fern fronds, the faint creak of massive trunks swaying in the high-altitude air currents. All of it had stopped. It was as if an invisible wall had descended around the bench, cutting off every sound from the outside world. The air grew impossibly thick, cold and heavy, carrying a faint sickly odor, not of rot, but of something metallic and ozone-heavy, like the air inside a copper pipe. Then, from the fog 10 feet behind our backs came a sound. It was the distinct, crisp sound of leather boots stepping heavily onto a wet cedar branch. Snap. Marcus swung his light around instantly, the bright white beam cutting through the gray fog. There was nothing there. Just the pale, twisted trunks of stunted alpine firs fading into the white mist. "Who's there?" Marcus shouted. His hand had moved to his hip, resting on the butt of his sidearm. "National Park Service." "State your name." No answer. We stood back to back, our flashlights sweeping the perimeter of the clearing. The fog was rolling in faster now, thick as cotton, reducing our visual range to barely 15 feet. Then the voice spoke again. It didn't come from a distance. It came from right beside us, no more than 5 feet away, hovering in the empty air between two fir trees where there was nothing but fog. It was my voice. Not an imitation, not a strange echo. It was my voice, down to the slight rasp in my throat from the cold air, speaking with the exact pitch and rhythm I had used 20 minutes earlier in the draw. "Marcus," my voice said from the darkness, perfectly clear, perfectly dry. "Look at this." A heavy, suffocating shock hit me in the center of my chest. It was a physical sensation like stepping into an ice-cold lake. My heart slammed against my ribs so hard I could hear the pulse thumping in my ears. Marcus spun toward the sound, his flashlight beam trembling violently. "Tom," he breathed, his eyes wide, looking at me, then looking back at the empty patch of fog. "What was that?" "Don't listen to it," I managed to say, my own voice sounding strange and small in my ears. "Marcus, don't look at it. Pack the book. We're leaving right now." We didn't pack the tent. We didn't gather Julian's gear. Marcus shoved the small notebook into his jacket pocket, and we turned to head back down the steep slope of the draw. That was when the spatial orientation of the mountain seemed to collapse. When we had climbed onto the bench, the granite cliff face was on our right, and the steep descent back into the river draw was directly behind us to the south. We had walked no more than 30 yards across flat ground. We turned south, stepping off the edge of the flat ground to begin our descent. Instead of the steep, brush-choked draw we had spent 3 hours scrambling up, our boots stepped into a flat, open forest corridor lined with massive, ancient red cedars, trees that were far too large to exist at this altitude. The draw was gone. The creek sound was gone. There was only this flat, silent avenue of massive trunks stretching off into the mist in both directions. "Where's the trail?" Marcus whispered, stopping dead in his tracks. "Where's the drop-off?" He turned around. Behind us, the orange tent was gone. The bench was gone. There was only the endless repeating grid of massive gray tree trunks vanishing into the dense white fog. "We stepped off the bench," I said, trying to force logic back into my mind. "We must have angled too far east. The slope has to be right here." I took 3 steps forward, reaching out with my hand to find the drop-off. My boot came down on flat, firm ground. I took another step. Flat ground. I pulled my compass from my pocket. It was an old, reliable Brunton pocket transit. I opened the brass casing and held it level in front of my chest. The needle wasn't spinning erratically like in a bad movie. It was resting firmly, pointing due magnetic north. I turned until the needle pointed south, the direction that should have led us down the draw toward the CCC shelter and the river. We walked south. We walked for 20 minutes. The terrain remained entirely flat. The massive cedars stood at identical intervals, their lowest branches far above us, disappearing into the white ceiling of fog. The ground beneath our feet was smooth, covered in a uniform layer of damp gray moss that showed no signs of animal tracks, fallen branches, or rocks. It was an impossible landscape. There were no flat plateaus of this size anywhere in the Bogachiel drainage. At 3,500 feet, the terrain was supposed to be a vertical wilderness of razor-backed ridges, steep gullies, and fractured rock. "Tom," Marcus said, stopping. He was breathing heavily, sweat glistening on his forehead despite the freezing cold. "Stop walking," I stopped. "We have to keep moving, Marcus. If we sit down, hypothermia will set in." "Look at the trees," he said quietly. I looked at the massive cedar trunk to my left. Carved into the rough, fibrous bark at eye level were 3 short, clean notches. Fresh wood showed beneath. The gray surface, I had carved those exact 3 notches into a fallen log 2 hours earlier down in the creek bed to mark a slippery crossing point. We hadn't walked 3 miles south. We were walking in a circle on ground that felt flat, but was somehow returning us to the same point over and over again. "It's folding the space," I whispered, the words slipping out before I could stop them. "Don't talk crazy." Marcus snapped, though his voice was laced with terror. It's the fog. We've lost our spatial orientation. We're suffering from sensory deprivation. That's all this is. We sit down, pull out the bivy sacks, wait for daylight, and use the altimeter to drop straight down into the valley floor. There is no daylight in here, Marcus, I said, looking up at the uniform, gray mass above us. Look at your watch. Marcus looked down at his wrist. The digital display on his Casio watch was blank. The liquid crystal screen was dead, frozen on a series of garbled, fragmented numbers. I pulled out my own analog field watch. The second hand was moving, but it wasn't ticking once per second. It was sweeping around the face in smooth, silent, erratic lunges, speeding up, slowing down, stopping for 3 seconds, then whirling forward. Then, from 40 feet ahead of us in the fog, we heard the sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate. Wet steps, squelch, squelch, squelch. We froze, raising our flashlights. Out of the mist stepped a figure. My heart plummeted into my stomach. For a fraction of a second, relief washed over me, cold and sweet. It was a man. He was wearing a green rain jacket, dark trousers, and a ranger hat. He had his back turned to us, standing perfectly still beside one of the massive cedar trunks. "Hey," Marcus cried out, stepping forward. "Hey, is that you, Miller? Or is that the SAR unit?" "Marcus, wait!" I screamed, grabbing his pack strap and yanking him back with all my weight. "What are you doing?" Marcus yelled, struggling against my grip. "It's a ranger!" "Look at his arms," I whispered, my mouth bone dry. Marcus stopped moving. The figure was standing 15 feet away. The green rain jacket was an identical copy of the National Park Service uniform jacket I was wearing. The jacket had the iconic arrowhead patch on the left shoulder, but the arms hanging from the sleeves were wrong. They were far too long. They extended down past his knees, ending in hands that were tucked deep into his pockets, and as we watched, the head of the figure slowly began to turn toward us. It didn't turn with the smooth, organic movement of a neck. It moved in sharp, ratcheting notches like the second hand on my broken watch. The face that turned to look at us was not Julian Miller. It was not a ranger. It was my own face. It had my features, my straight nose, my thin lips, my light brown hair. But the proportions were subtly, horribly distorted. The eyes were slightly too far apart. The skin stretched so tight over the cheekbones that it looked like polished plastic. And its eyes were completely, utterly flat, devoid of light, depth, or reflection. It opened its mouth. The mouth opened far wider than a human jaw could stretch, exposing smooth pink gums with no teeth. From that wide, empty cavity came Marcus's voice, bright, cheerful, and loud, exactly as he had spoken to me in the duty office 4 hours earlier. "Grab your heavy pack. Tom, we leave in 20 minutes. A primal animal terror took hold of me. I didn't think. I didn't reason. I grabbed Marcus by his jacket collar and dragged him backward with all the strength in my body. "Run," I screamed. "Run!" We ran. We bolted through the flat cedar corridor, ignoring the branches that whipped across our faces, ignoring the heavy packs bouncing against our spines. We ran blind, sprinting through the thick white fog, our boots tearing up the gray moss beneath us. Behind us, the voice kept calling out. It didn't chase us with footsteps. The sound just bounced around us, coming from the left, from the right, from directly overhead. It used my voice. Is it his? It used Marcus's voice. He stayed the night here. It used Sarah's voice from dispatch, proceeding toward his location. Over. It was a chorus of our own words, chopped up, rearranged, and hurled back at us like stones. We kept running until my lungs felt like they were filled with crushed glass, until my legs buckled under me and I slammed face first into a pile of damp, rotting wood. Marcus crashed down beside me, gasping for air, his hands clutching his chest. I pushed myself up onto my elbows, shaking violently, my flashlight beam wildly sweeping the ground in front of us. We were no longer in the cedar corridor. The massive, identical trunks were gone. We were crouching at the base of a sharp, rocky slope, surrounded by tangled thickets of salmonberry and fallen alder trunks. Below us, 50 yards down a steep incline, I could hear a sound. It was the deep, thunderous, unmistakable roar of the Bogachiel River. We were back in the canyon. The steep, vertical reality of the mountain had returned as suddenly as it had vanished. "Look," Marcus choked out, pointing a trembling hand downward. Through the break in the thicket, 50 yards down the slope, sat the three-sided CCC shelter. A soft, dim light was visible inside, the glow of our own lanterns that we had left on the wooden bench hours earlier. We scrambled down the slope, sliding on our hands and seats through the dirt, crashing through the brush until we burst into the small clearing. We threw ourselves into the shelter, backing up against the rear stone wall, away from the open front entrance. Marcus pulled his service pistol from his holster, holding it with both hands, his arms shaking so hard the barrel rattled against his knees. I grabbed an axe that was stowed in the wood corner, pulling it across my chest. We sat there in the dark, shivering, our heartbeats hammering in the heavy silence. The fog didn't enter the shelter. It hung at the edge of the roofline, a thick white curtain hovering 3 inches above the dirt floor. Outside, the forest was completely quiet again. The river roared in the distance, a steady, comforting anchor to the real world. For 4 hours we didn't move. We didn't speak. We sat with our backs against the cold, dry stones of the shelter wall, watching the open entry, waiting for the fog to lift or for the thing outside to speak again. Around 3 in the morning, the wind shifted. A cold, sharp breeze came tearing down from the high peaks, blowing the fog out of the lower valley. The white curtain receded, lifting into the high canopy, exposing the clear, dark sky above, pin-pricked with cold, sharp stars. The moment the fog cleared, the pressure in my ears vanished. The heavy metallic smell of ozone was replaced by the clean, sharp scent of pine needles and damp river silt. Marcus let out a long, ragged breath. His handgun lowered, resting on his lap. "We leave at first light," he whispered, his voice hoarse, sounding 10 years older than he had that morning. "Yeah," I replied. We didn't sleep. As soon as the first gray light of dawn began to bleed through the trees at 6 a.m., we packed our gear in total silence. We didn't discuss what we had seen. We didn't mention the campsite, the notebook, or the figure with my face. We walked out of the Bogachiel Valley at a pace that bordered on a sprint. We reached the trailhead at 9 in the morning. Julian Miller's Ford Ranger was still sitting in the gravel turnout, its windshield covered in wet cedar needles. We drove straight to the regional office in Port Angeles. The official report we filed was precise, sparse, and completely devoid of the truth. We stated that we had located the subject's camp at the 2,900-foot level in the North Fork Draw. We noted that the subject was missing, presumed to have fallen or succumbed to exposure during an off-trail detour. We submitted his notebook and his glasses as found personal effects. A full search and rescue operation was launched 48 hours later, once the storm system had passed. Over 60 volunteers, K-9 units, and military helicopters searched the upper Bogachiel Cirque for 5 days. They found nothing. They never found Julian Miller's body. They never found his boots, which we had left sitting side by side in his tent. When the SAR team reached the upper bench, they reported that the tent was collapsed, shredded by wind, but the sleeping bag and the boots were gone. I resigned from the National Park Service 3 weeks later. Marcus Reyes retired early, 6 months after the incident. He moved to eastern Oregon, out into the dry, high desert country where there are no trees, no fog, and no moss. I haven't spoken to him since the day we signed our witness statements. I live in Spokane now. I work a quiet desk job for a private land surveying firm. I don't go hiking. I don't go camping. I don't like being in a room where I can't see all 4 corners at once, and I keep my heavy curtains pulled shut every time a foggy front rolls in from the coast, because I know what's out there in those deep, wet drainages of the Olympic Range. It isn't a monster that wants to kill you with teeth and claws. It is something far older, far stranger, and infinitely more patient. It sits in the places where human maps run out listening to us. It gathers our names, our voices, our laughter, and our calls for help. It holds them in the dark under the moss, waiting for someone to step off the trail and listen to their own voice calling back from the trees. Pyborough.